I'm Robert Moore, and I will be lecturing this week and next week on a topic that I lecture widely over the country on, which is 4 archetypes of the masculine. And I want to just take a moment to tell you a little bit about what I propose to do tonight and next week. First of all, I have a number of assumptions. While I am professor of psychology and religion, and while I do have a research interest in ancient forms of personality and culture, studying the archetypes of the masculine and historical forms is it's interesting, but it's not interesting enough for me to spend as much time thinking about it as I do just in itself. That is to say that that the topic I'm talking about tonight has got enormous contemporary relevance for contemporary men and women, and so it's not merely an academic research interest, though certainly there are a lot of people that have spent a lot of time studying these patterns. In phenomenology, they talk about these as structure of the human experience. That's just a way of saying archetype without admitting it. So in other words, one of the things I just want to say is we study, in this context, archetypes or the masculine or anything else in relationship to their transformative significance, that is, their significance for contemporary life. And understanding what goes wrong in this case in the lives of men and why, and to get some ideas about how that might be changed for the better. So the one thing I'd like to say just a little bit about before we get into the 2 archetypes I'm going to talk about tonight, which are the king and the warrior archetypes, is the I want to elaborate just a second, just a few minutes anyway, on this idea of the relationships between the archetypes and transformation. And this is going to go real fast, and you have to study sacred space and transformation, that sort of thing, to get this in a lot more detail. I have tapes here that I've given on space and transformation, which would elaborate this. But the structure of transformation in human personality is threefold. There is what is known as the preliminal space, that is the time prior to a major transition and change. You might say this is before you admit that you're going to be getting a divorce, or before you admit to yourself that either you're going to shoot yourself or you're going to get in therapy, or you're going to become a hopeless alcoholic, one of the 3. It's before you get the nature and extent and enormity of one's personal crisis clearly in mind. That is massive denial, right? Massive denial. And this should be familiar to all of us, since we do so much of the time, all of us. And our culture majors in it. If I had any one phrase to characterize American culture, it is manic defense. Manic defense. And it's not just American culture, of course, although other world cultures typically do not do as much, do not spend as much energy in denying the reality and presence of evil as we do. They don't have attitudes toward it that I approve of very much, but certainly if you walk the streets of Bombay or Bangkok, as I have recently, you will see that they don't bother to deny it too much, or to cover it up too much, or to repress it too much. But in this stage, it's massive denial, and this is the stage Jungian would talk about it as persona. You're still locked in persona. If you flirt with transformation and you realize what it's going to cost you, either financially or emotionally, then you try to have what Jung called a regressive restoration of the persona, which means you try to make out like nothing is different. You try to make out like you don't know what it is that you know. Because if you admitted that you know what you know, and then you would be forced into something, it's like, please, Mr. Custer, I don't want to go. But anyway, so that's the first stage. Now, many people manage to live and die pretty much in that. But this is the stage at which the archetype always comes on like gangbusters. This is threshold 1, and this is threshold 2. This is threshold you have to go over to get into extraordinary space. And then this is a threshold you have to go over to get out of it, or as out of it as human beings ever get. But when you realize that something is very wrong with your life as it's functioning, then there will be constellated in your psyche a unconscious or conscious, one of the two, quest for a sacred space and some sort of ritual elder who will help you undergo some form of initiation. So in my work on this topic, there are three archetypal motifs that are always together in a process of transformation that works. That is, if it works, these things are together. There are a lot of cases in where it doesn't work, but there is a magus or ritual elder, better known as a magician or healer. There is a sacred space, which is carefully bounded, where the power of the archetypes can be related to without getting destroyed. And there is an understanding of the archetypes initiation, which is what one is going through in that process of change. In the context that we're talking about tonight, we're talking about masculine initiation. We could just as well talk about feminine initiation. And we're going to be talking about different aspects, initiating different aspects of a masculine. Tonight, the initiation of the king sense, initiation of the warrior. But anyway, what I'm trying to tell you is that this is an archetypal process always going on in the psyche, either badly or effectively, or some combination of the two, usually. And so hopefully this is where you encounter they used to talk about encountering the sacred. And in this context, we will say the archetypal patterns, which are loaded with power for regeneration. That's what they're for regeneration. They're also loaded with power that can make you crazy. And that's not what they're for, because what happens to a lot of people. Anyway, they are clearly numinous. Clearly numinous, that is to say, loaded with a sense of power. And Jung said that transformation always occurs through the members. You may get band-aids some other way, but real transformation and healing comes through an encounter with the members. And we'll have an occasion to talk about that more in a little bit. Anyway, so hopefully the process goes like this. You realize your need for change. You find a guide in sacred space and undergo whatever ritual humiliation you're meeting time ago in this initiatory process, and you deal with whatever task it is that you've been avoiding, and then you regenerated and empowered, leave this and go on, bringing back the boon, as Joseph Campbell said, to your world, to the realm. And so that is that's the shape of transformative space. In this context of this class tonight, in terms of the masculine, if you're accessing masculine archetypes well, and your masculine initiation was heavily and thoroughly consolidated, then you may not need to get into this with regard to masculine archetypes. But if you're like 99% of us, you probably need some regenerative contact with the archetypal masculine. That is, both than both females and males need to live with. We're usually so terribly wounded in the masculine, all of us.
And you mentioned humiliation needed. Best that you need.
Well, initiation as a structure almost always involves an experience of humiliation. Now, the part of us that is so easily feels humiliating is usually the infantile grandiosity. And so often in the course of getting initiated, we feel humiliated a lot of the time when, if we really had our initiation carried out thoroughly in earlier time, or our parenting, if the parenting we had received in early childhood had been sufficient, we would not be nearly so humiliated. As a litmus test, the more humiliated you feel, the more of the time, the crazier you are in terms of narcissistic pathology. And it's not your fault. And it is the more sensitive and easily hurt we are, the less decent parenting we got. And the more susceptible to humiliation we are. Feelings of humiliation. And therefore, any kind of individuation process that we go into, trying to realize our potential, even as men and women, will be experienced as humiliating. And what's really getting humiliated and relativized is the grandiosity. But it's very important that we understand that the chances are that everybody you see during every day has got a problem with grandiosity. And it is the ubiquitous problem in human life. And we can talk about that more later in terms of the way. See, here's a rule you can buy with men. Men get into trouble on the shadow sides of these archetypes when they have not had the experiences which can help them transform their infantile grandiosity. And they will tend to act out in grandiose ways out of these masculine archetypes, one or more, to the extent that they've been really wounded by children, to the extent that they've had real solid nurture. It will be much easier for a man to mature and consolidate his masculinity and to be a man who can access these archetypes in a positive. So that gets the assumptions I'm operating out very, very, very clearly. That is, these four archetypes I'm talking about, king, warrior, magician, and lover, are psychological structures in the psyche. They are amoral. They are numinous in their power. If and one can access them like any archetypal structure, either constructively or destructively, or a combination of both, which is where we live. So we're going to be talking about the light side, what I would call the constructive expression of that archetype, and the shadow expression of it. And so what I propose to do now, if it's all right with you, is to launch into a discussion of these archetypes, their purpose, and something about their structure, and I'm just going to lecture a while, so I'll with you, and feel free to interrupt me and raise your hand if I'm unclear about something, and I'll try to respond to that point. We'll take a break about, what time have you been taking a break? About 8? We'll take the 10-minute break. Yes.
Could you just blur what you and contain in your...
Yeah. I've been doing a lot of work on narcissism, literature on narcissism. And the people who have done the most work on this are very clear that narcissistic pathology manifests itself in a very primitive structure in the psyche, which Freudians call the grandiose self-organization. That means there's an actual entity in the psyche which is split off from the consciousness of the person usually, but which is sort of a Lord Fauntleroy. Feels entitled, doesn't feel it has to do anything, deserves rewards and an adoration, and hates criticism, very sensitive and easily hurt, blah, blah, blah. And you can look in the DSM-3 or the DSM-3R under the narcissistic personality disorder, and it gives a clinical description of it. Basically, it just means a very childish sense of one's own importance and powers, one that really does not correspond to reality, but which dominates one's self-appraisal, either in a positive sense or negative sense. Now, let me just make one thing clear. We'll talk about a narcissistic personality disorder is a person who has a very destructive relationship with his king archetype.
Interferes
with this king archetype I'm going to talk about in a minute. A narcissist really is has a sort of a shadow appropriation of a king archetype. They really think they're a king. Unconsciously, they really act like they think they're a king. And internally, they really do think they're a king. They are, in effect, possessed by the archetype. There are two ways that these archetypes are typically affect you destructively. One, they can possess you, and the other, it can oppress you. If you're a person who thinks you're God's gift to the world, it's probably the grandiose self probably has possessed you. If you think you're just a piece of shit, your grandiose self-organization is oppressing you. It isn't that you are without a grandiose self-organization. It just means it's split off from your ego consciousness and attacks you all the time. It attacks the ego consciousness all the time. So if you're extremely self-critical and find yourself undervaluing yourself a lot of the time, you are under attack by this structure in the psyche that is just outside of just out of the room a little bit, but you can tell its presence by the way you're feeling. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but well, it certainly is, but that's where you get a manic depressive, bipolar or cyclothymic kind of cycling or bipolar disorder. Manic depression is nothing other than someone who wobbles back and forth from a over-identification with the archetypal self in human terms to a sense of being alienated from it and attacked by it. So we can talk more later about depression in that context. If a person is depressed a lot, in my view, the old way of talking about that used to be that a manic presentation where one is really high and flying high and everything is a defense against one's depression, compared to the manic defense against depression earlier. I tend to think that most of the time it's just the opposite dynamic involved, that depression is a defense against grandiosity. And that the more depressed you are, the more hidden grandiosity you've got. And the quicker you find the hidden grandiosity and puncture it, the quicker depression will lift. And I think if you'll explore that, you'll find that a fruitful place to dig. But let me get into these specific archetypes now, and then we will discuss them. I think I'd like to just sort of outline them both before our break. That way you can get a chance to compare them a little bit. Let me talk a little bit about the archetype of the king. The best place to study this sort of thing, of course, is in the literature on sacred kingship, sacral kingship, which has been a topic of study for a long, long time in history of religions and anthropology. The first thing to realize is that there's no such thing as a king who is not a sacred king. There's no such thing as secular kingship. That is, the whole idea of king is a religious category. The best thing I've seen from a psychological point of view on this was the book by John Weir Perry, which I think is now out of print, but I'm hoping they're going to bring it back out. It's a little paperback entitled Lord of the Four Quarters, Myths of the Royal Father. Perry published this little book in which he brought together a lot of the myths about the sacred king, and then wrote an introduction to it, which I think is the finest thing I've ever seen psychologically on this. And Perry points out several different functions that the sacred king played. In my work on this topic, I've just basically continued where Perry left off. But he says several things. First of all, the king is the source of fertility. For the realm. That is, kingship is a phenomenon of archaic conceptions of fertility. If the king is what the king ought to be, then everything will flourish. See the relationship between the king and creativity? It's right there in those of you who are Christians. It's right there in Christian iconography and symbolism. Christ the King is at the center of the world. You can see many of these churches where there's a crown up there on the cross. And it is through the sacrifice, the person of the King, that the world is nourished. And nourished in the Christian iconography through some of the symbols show wine coming down from the foot of the cross. Grapes. The cross is sort of a wine press, and the world is sort of renewed through with the blood. But that is just one representation of this ancient attitude toward kings. And there was an ancient practice whereby we've heard and think queen for a day. Well, that is an acting out of a very ancient practice, except they don't carry it as far. That is a reflection of the ancient practice of killing the king. In the earliest times, we think that the kings were slaughtered after a certain period of reign to ensure the continued fertility of the world. And the whole concept of sacrifice is related to kingship. In this archaic worldview. The important thing, king's okay, world is okay. Creativity flows. Something wrong with the king, something wrong with the realm. The legends about the Fisher King, the Grail King, the kings that are wounded king, the kings that are wounded in the groin, as you see in the Parsifal stories, there is a flaw at the heart of the being when there's something wrong with the king. We'll see a little bit more about how you can understand that a little bit. What else? Well, fertility, but right order. You've all heard that little story about the rainmaker. Now, the rainmaker, there's not been any rain, the rainmaker goes into the hut, puts himself in the dial, or whatever the system is, puts himself right with the forces of the universe, and then it rains. Well, that story is a kind of a deteriorated form of the story about the king, because it is really the king who, if he is right, nature is right. You get many different images of this in different cultures. You get the concept of Dharma, you get the concept of the Tao, and you get the concept of Fatah. Various cultures, different ideas about this. You get the similar thing in Judaism, that the king was supposed to have been in Israel an upholder of a transcendent law of God. But in any case, right order. And it's not based on coercion. That's not supposed to be based on coercion. It's supposed to be an inner thing, that this order grows out of the inside of things. That if it's not imposed from without, if the king is right, it is an order which issues from within things. The third thing that I have added, because I've worked a lot more with some more ways this stuff works, is the role of the king in blessing, which, as you can see, related to the first, but it's not simply that. You can watch this structure operating in contemporary life in terms of papal audiences at St. Peter's, and the fascination with wanting to view the royal family when they're out in travels. Another place you see it, if you didn't know this archetype, you wouldn't recognize it. You wouldn't recognize it as such, is you see it in the Indian gurus and ashrams, in the practice of what's known as darshan, which is viewing the guru and being viewed by the guru, who sits up on an elevated platform. Well, that's just the archetype of the king and the thumb. There is something in human beings that wants to be seen by this thing. Those of you who studied some psychology probably are reminded of Erickson's idea of confirmation, that a young adult needs an experience of confirmation before their identity would be consolidated. But this is what I just call blessing. The king has the eye of blessing. And, of course, can give it or withhold it. And one of the things that you want to think about when you're thinking about your own masculinity, your own masculine side, is your experience with the kings in your life, or the king in your life, and whether you got the eye of blessing or its corollary, which is the curse. And if you study the history of religion, particularly the Hebrew scriptures, you constantly get this imagery about who got the blessing and who got the curse. It's right up front. Blessing is a real thing in the Hebrew scriptures. Well, it's a real thing in most human scriptures, because it is a real thing in the human psyche. And if you are a mature adult, you got blessed. If you've had trouble getting yourself together, you didn't get blessed. That's simple. And it takes some mediation of this archetypal structure to get blessed. And we can talk a little bit later about the way this affects people and families. But it's quite clear that if a man is accessing the positive side of this archetypal pattern, he will probably be a pretty creative person himself. Yes. You see these things as separable in himself. Well, in the pattern, in the archetype, they're not separable in actual expressions in life. That's arguable. But archetypes are patterns which is like that thing about the magician, initiation, and sacred space being together. With a king, you get this concern for creativity, and he'll just say creativity there too. Creativity, order, and blessing. And if a man the word generative comes to mind here. If a man is in touch with this part of himself in a constructive way, and a good enough way, as Winnicott might say, then he will not be feeling stagnated or despairing of his age, feeling over the hill at 45 or whatever. He won't be like the millions of retired who feel that their life is over at 65. In fact, a man who's really in touch with this in many ways finds his vocation most strongly at 55 and can continue it as long as he can keep his health. But anyway, he will not be, he will not, if he's accessing this in a good enough way, he won't be consumed with anxiety. Another thing he won't be is a workaholic. See, we'll get to workaholics when I talk about the warrior archetypes. You get workaholism when you get a warrior archetype, which gives you lots of energy and attack modes without any balance in its centering. And so if it moves, you work more. You just work hard. It's your solution to everything. Just work hard. But in any case, and another, the real thing, if you work in organizations, if a man is adequately related to this, he will be a pretty good mentor. He will not be threatened by other people getting insight, power, capability. He will be capable of being invested in empowering other people. He won't be so preoccupied with his own impotence that he can't support the empowerment of other people, both men and women. Feminists are fond of saying that the shadow expression of this is patriarchy, and that this person is out to disempower women. Well, they're partially right. This person is out to disempower women. But what many feminists don't realize is he's out to disempower men too. He's playing king of the mountain. He doesn't want anybody getting any independent center of initiative. He wants to be adored. He wants to be, as we put it in the technical literature, mirrored. He doesn't want to mirror you. He wants to be nurtured. He doesn't want to nurture you. If he's a graduate school professor, he wants graduate students who mirror and nurture him and his work. He does not want to nurture them and their work. And you see many other expressions of it. But this capacity to empower is right here, and this capacity to bless. And there you get the issue of power, which is key in all these masculine archetypes. I think in many ways it's a key concept in relating to any expression of the archetypal in human life. As we'll see next week, it's very tempting to use knowledge and insight simply for personal aggrandizement. And certainly, archetypal power and energy is simply one thing that you can exploit and use, and humans are real good at that. But the thing that I go around trying to get people to realize is that this image of the king is not something I would like for men to lose access to. If they lose access to it, then they're cutting off an enormous amount of their own sense of potential. And it's because we have such a little experience of the positive side of this in real men that we become so cynical and sometimes even nihilistic about masculinity and begin to equate masculinity with patriarchy, which is very common in intellectual realms today, to equate masculinity and patriarchy. In my view, the two are not to be equated at all, at all. Patriarchy is a shadow expression, in my view, of the masculine, and is really a very infantile expression, masculinity.
So to say is that keener cope with one that's inable, it's frightening and nurturing.
Yes, yes. And if a man is able to access this, the sort of the true king, the light king aspect of this, he doesn't see. It's this. You see this in the Senex Puer split. If you've got a mature man, the arrogance of a young man does not make him want to kill him. See, I mean, there's some humor in the more mature man when he runs on the arrogance of Puer. And the more mature man is much more likely to feel affection for the young man, even in the midst of his arrogance. He's much more likely to, a more mature man is much more likely to look at a really sharp young puer, arrogant puer, and say, wow, what this guy could be, with some help. I've got, the response would be more like, I've got to keep him from getting himself killed. I've got to help him not self-destruct. Because if there's anybody that's in the positive side of this, he's run into a lot of the negative side of it. He knows there are a lot of Sauls around. There are a lot of Herods around who, when they run into a really sharp young man or a woman, really want to kill them, literally. The hate and envy in the shadow expression of this is enormous. So let me talk a little bit about Shadow King before I go on to the warrior. We'll elaborate all this in our discussion. So the shadow side of this thing is really manifest in a real feeling of impotence and a related feeling of paranoia. The man who's really alienated from this thing and can't access it in the right way, yet is experiencing it. I really serious. Look at Saul in the Bible stories, and look at Herod, and look at Caligula, and just study some historical manifestation of kingship. There is a sense on the part of the Shadow King that chaos is breathing down his neck. It's just about to get him. And everywhere he looks, he sees conspiracy. And, of course, if he's been brutal and sadistic enough, he's managed to generate a lot of palace coups, would-be palace coups, because he richly deserves being deposed. But he's totally incapable of blessing and really wants to be blessed, feels the need to be blessed, and will do everything he can to locate anybody who has the talent to be a threat and try to do away with them in whatever means he can't. You see this a lot in gratuitous humiliation of subordinates in front of other people. One thing you look for. Anytime you're ever present when a superior is highly critical of a subordinate, you're seeing the shadow side of this thing in operation. There's an Oriental principle, always help people save face. And the positive expression of this in a personality will make an individual who's in a leadership position very aware of the necessity for helping people save face and will minimize humiliation of subordinates. In fact, on the contrary, will take every opportunity to lift the achievement of the subordinate to the attention of others in the organization. So there are a lot of expressions of this, but the reality of the cursing is the central theme in the shadow expression of this. It's always the misuse of these archetypes, all four of them, is always a power trip. Power as opposed to eros or love. The shadow expression of all of them comes out in what the Jungians call the power shadow. No doubt they heard about them.
People get modern this incident.
Well, I think there are many. Stalin is the one that's clearest, most documented. There are histories full of examples of it. But Richard Nixon's paranoid side, his paranoid side was coming out of this. And the thing that people project upon Ronald Reagan, unless they're liberal intellectuals, is the positive aspect. I say they're projected on Ronald Reagan, say that he embodies that. But the enormous power that man's got politically in terms of appeal to wide ranges of people who don't even agree with him on things, is that Ronald Reagan, that he is able to elicit projection of the positive side of this king archetype. Remember, somebody once asked me, well, you're always talking about the king and all these others. Why don't you ever talk about the archetype of the father? Well, this is the archetype of the father. Remember, if something is not numinous, it's not an archetype. Tip. And an ordinary father is not numinous. When a lot of the struggle that we have, and this is just an important point to make, see, part of our developmental struggle is getting over our quest for the archetypal mother and father. Because the only time you can really access that in normal development is between 1 and 4. When your actual parents can really carry the archetypal parents. After your cognitive function gets better, they can't be the archetypal parents for you. And the real problem of the human predicament is that by the time you reach adulthood, nobody can finally adequately carry the archetypal for you because you're too smart. You're not stupid. You can see that XYZ is not an archetype. This is what gets into the transference in therapy relationships. You see that your analyst or your therapist is not an archetype. And depending on what resources the school of thought of the person has to help you deal with that horrible realization, whether or not one gets healed. Happily, in Jungian thought, we don't believe that the only way you can get to these archetypes is through the analyst. We believe you're wired for these archetypes and that you can connect with them internally and that you need not simply have them mediated by somebody, some human in the outside world. Let me talk a little bit about the warrior, and I'll probably need to elaborate it more after I break. It's very difficult in contemporary culture, and unless you're teaching at the War College, to talk about the positive side of the warrior archetype. That's not something people want to hear about. But here, as in many other places, when you're dealing with a psychological potential, as Jung would point out, you're not talking about something that's good or bad. You're talking about something that's there. It's obviously got some sort of purpose. You either use it for what it's for, or you misuse it, or you get used by it. The warrior is the same thing. And although I have many, many friends and associates that are very big in the peace movement and who really are irritated with me about talking about this. I hold very strongly to the fact that this is a ubiquitous phenomenon in every psyche, and including the peacenik, and it has a number of very positive traits that come out of it, positive potentials that come out of it. What are some of them? You tell me. What are some of the positive things that come from the warrior aspect in the psyche? It's related to achievement. What is required for achievement, you might say. The things that are required for achievement. And courage would be one of them. What else? Frankly, persistence, and I would add to that an important thing for the warrior, stamina, which is another way of saying similar thing. Stamina, that is, that when you're really exhausted, that's when you redouble your efforts. You don't focus so much on your comfort state. Adlerian psychologists are fond of talking about comfort types. People that get tired if they even envision some task. Sit down. I better have another drink before I think about that anymore. But it's a capacity to persevere in the face of pain, and this is very key. And to think about ordeals, task ordeals. It's the capacity to focus on a task, which may require that you not be comfortable, or that your experience not be pleasant. Anybody, for example, that's working on any creative project needs a lot of this archetypal potential. If you're working on a book manuscript, if you're working on and building some new institution or some new institutional expression that is really requiring focus, without this thing, you will not have much active focus. The capacity to be proactive and not just passive in the face of situations. I was just reading today that they've begun to link inability to get angry, express anger, and attack with cancer, the onset of cancer. And it's no accident that somebody like Simons and the other people get people to imagine their immunological system attacking cancer cells. But it's an interesting reflection to think about the inability to recognize an enemy that's truly an enemy. That's what's going on in AIDS. It's what goes on in cancer. It's what goes on in a number of kinds of illnesses. But you would argue that at the archetypal level, if this archetype is not being accessed adequately, you cannot recognize an enemy when it really exists. And you certainly cannot mobilize your forces. You certainly cannot get focused. And you certainly cannot stand the pain which is required to attend to the task, regardless of whether or not the ants are biting you. And so there are many others, and you could elaborate these and can elaborate them. But it's my sense that very few worthwhile things get done without a lot of accessing of this particular psychological potential. You will never have a great artist that doesn't have a lot of it. And you could argue that that would be true in a lot of different creative professional roles. In fact, the shadow side of the warrior is something that you see present in very creative people. That is to say, it's very difficult for a warrior to value relationships, intimate relationships, very highly. Intimate, committed, marital type relationships. This is not an archetype that is much into the female archetype of Hera. And this particular archetypal structure leaves the wife at home. He would defend the wife and the kids to the death out there somewhere on the boundaries of the empire. And he would have the most beautiful camp followers to tend to his personal needs. I think of the movie An Officer and a Gentleman. And you know the subcultures around the Marine Corps. Always faithful. This is my rifle and this is my gun. This is for fighting and this is for fun. Well, there is a certain attitude towards sexuality and women in the part of the warrior archetype. The Greeks had a saying that Mars and Aphrodite had an affair. That's exactly correct archetypally. And the man who is in a lot of Mars energy may be married, but his energies will not be going into building harmony. It will be building some creative product. And the kind of woman that will really elicit his eros will be what Tony Wolfe called the hetara, the companion, the woman who can mirror him and see how great he is as an artist or intellectual or soldier or whatever. And there may be great sex, but little marriage. See, in this guy. So the shadow side of this thing is that if you don't have a lot of eros, if you're not accessing the archetype of the lover enough, which we'll get to next week, you can really get into being a warrior without much concern for humans. What I call the Shiva principle. You can get into the firepower side of this and into the joy of destruction. Now, this is something that exists in human life that most people do not like to look at. They need to look at it because it's there. This part of the psyche that, when it's constellated, just loves killing. It's the part that when you get wounded enough and you regress enough, get your pump 12 gauge and say, I'm going to go down to the local McDonald's and I'm going to kill me some humans. And kill me some humans. And I'm going to kill as many, as fast, as thoroughly as I can. And I'm going to enjoy the hell out of it. It's a very widespread phenomenon, and in your lifetime is likely to grow because of collapse of structures that inhibit this sort of thing. Cultural structures, cultural values, and the television culture, drugs, drug flood, and all sorts of other. We're turning out borderline personalities in droves. Our school system exists for the purpose of turning out borderline personalities.
Bring out more what?
Borderline personalities. The system exists, obviously, if you just look at what it does to generate and support gangs and borderline personalities. And it's part of our denial system, our massive denial system, that we do not realize how serious this is. This is enormously serious business. And it's one interesting thing that this warrior archetype is so unconscious in our culture now, particularly among the leadership, so-called leadership, that you don't get practically any leadership that is interested in focusing the seriousness of our situation culturally, much less trying to do anything. I mean, I'm always amused at people that think that the most adequate thing you do about the drug trade is build more drug rehabilitation centers. It's amazing.
On one of the years ago, John Gordon's science fiction, I read a book called Scan and Hand and Bite. And into the good right from us. Either in was simply he would take wine, social phenomenon and then just project it. And what he did on this one was oscillation, one of the hands about it. And what he had in there growing was people going amok, running not. And when I read that book, it was in the 60s. And I know of a couple instances, they just sling with and torrent, right. But the more and more and more, I mean, it really is kind of frightening, but we can just see it. And what it seems to be is just like all the cultural, and it always happens in big cities, where the pressuring.
Well, it started happening in rural areas now. Over Christmas, there was this man in a rural area, southern state, that got his guns and killed his entire family when they came home for Christmas. Killed all of them. It is this thing. You see, this isn't, you understand something. I get to keep this clear because it's important to get a sense of what archetypes are. I mean, archetypal psychology is real practical and real scary because what you're seeing is an increasing manifestation of the gods and goddesses in the absence of egos and ego structures and self-structures, as the Freudians call it. The less ego strength and self-structures you have, the more you're going to see of the infantile grandiosity. That's what a god is. It's infantile grandiosity. And the Greeks knew it. The Greeks said, you don't want to act like gods, goddesses, because they're messes. You want to be like them. Today, we tend to be a little romantic about the archetypes, Wow, I want to have an archetypal experience. Well, that's misunderstanding it. It's not pretty. And you don't want to be an archetype, and you don't want to be possessed by one, and you don't want to run around loose. And what we've got now is increasing number of archetypes running around loose. And Mars is god of war, and he gets loose and runs around. They got a lot of firepower now. I mean, with the firepower you can get now on the black market, you can do a lot of damage in a short period of time. And it's very interesting, if you know anything at all about the drug situation, you know that the police are completely outgunned, totally, overwhelmingly outgunned. They've got their little pea shooters up against Israeli Uzis, and at least Uzis. And most police, if you talk to any that know anything about this, you're very careful not to make arrests. Unless the drug people know you're going to arrest them, in which case you've already got a prearrangement. Because you don't want to get killed. So this thing is going to be an increasing thing, and the whole pop cultural scene, the rock scene, is a manifestation of the gods and the goddesses, and the manic acting out that's involved in a lot of the culture that you and I may like, drugs, sex, and rock and roll, is archetypal. And it manifests most clearly in the most raw form where there aren't any ego structures. And so increasingly what we're going to have is more bizarre expressions of this. And it's not a very pretty sight. But anyway, shadow side of the warrior. Very hard on relationships. See the movie The Great Santini. The Great Santini. A guy possessed with this thing. And it can lead to Lieutenant Calley or the Nazi SS. The Death's Head SS was a cult of this archetype, a cult of German war gods. And the whole ethos, the whole ethics and ethos of the Death's Head SS was a religious phenomenon. You could trace the line right back to the Aryan war god Indra, storm god Indra, a direct line, right? And predict the values, the attitudes, the behaviors, the cold steel attitude that all human feeling is weakness. Because when you're in this archetype, you do not feel except a sadistic pleasure, a erotic pleasure at hurting. Now, lest you think this is just expressed in bizarre ways, many couples in their marital fights get into this. You can tell when this is getting constellated, when the fights you're having just went past that point where you know there is going to be any communication at all. And where you know that you or your spouse or both are beginning to simply seek to hurt, which is most of the time marital squabbles. And this thing gets constellated, and the thing about it is it dissolves relationships. Once this thing is constellated, it starts firing. The only thing any human can do is engage in damage control, because it will dissolve structures and relationships when it's firing. Yes.
Relate to I'm stepping in while about desire. They're working. Who is a sexual peaceful warrior on
Yes.
A warrior who is asset.
I think it's very deeply related to that. They call Shambhala warriors, some of them. A lot of the peace people that I respect are very aware of this archetype. And know that you have to be a warrior if you're going to be serious about peace. And most martial arts traditions have this built into it. And the most advanced senseis in all the martial arts traditions are very peaceful souls. They know that if they have to act out, use the violence of their tradition, that they're trained, that their spirituality has failed. And so, for example, if you study Japanese kendo, which is the way of the sword, which is the whole ethic of the samurai, the ethic of the kendo sensei is one which, if somebody's foolish enough to come up to you and pick a fight, the true kendo specialist would never fight with them, if at all possible. There are many teaching stories about that I don't have time to tell, but it's related to what you're talking about. But you see, what I'm saying is built into this archetype. That is to say, that would also be true of a really mature man who was a Soviet general. And it would also be true of a mature man who was an American admiral. And this is what a lot of people don't realize, that it is not whether somebody proclaimed himself a pacifist or not. It is the relationship to this structure and what level one is relating to it, how one relates to it. But anyway, let's take a break for about 10 minutes, no more. One of the good things about Jungian thought is this whole concept of the archetypal self as distinct from the ego, or as distinct from the self with a little s. What I've been doing really is to elaborate the way in which the archetypal self manifests. A lot of people talk about this archetypal self like it's just sort of expressed in the Christ archetype or something. And that's really a radical oversimplification. The archetype of the self carries these four patterns in both masculine and feminine forms. And one of the important things to do is to realize that inflation, which is a Jungian idea of grandiosity or hubris, can express itself in any of these patterns. That all of these patterns are seen in the archetypal self. That is to say, if you look at the lore around Jesus, just take Jesus for example. Jesus is presented as king. Jesus is presented as the warrior. Jesus is presented as the magician. And Jesus is presented as the lover. And to the extent that something is a representation of the fullness of the self, it will carry all these things. Just like any living king who was really a very mature man would carry all of these things. any mature man would embody all of these archetypal structures in himself. But that doesn't help you differentiate the way in which the self itself is very multiplied. And we don't see people who manifest the archetype of the self very, solely. We see people who manifest aspects of it. And the chances are, if one is possessed or inflated, you're not manifesting all of them at once, probably. You're probably manifesting one side of it. For example, as we talked about earlier, the workaholic is very inflated. I mean, they may not feel inflated, but they're very inflated. They think they can do everything, or they feel like they ought to be able to do everything. You'll hear people say, "Oh, I just feel like it just needs to be." Of course, I never say anything like this.
Go for it.
But there just ought to be 24 more hours in a day. Only thing I need is 24 more hours. Well, there's the inflation of the workaholic. I'm going to change time. See, in order to be truly myself, I would have to be able to change the nature and flow of time. There's nothing great about that, right? Yes. That is to say, anytime you get anybody, here's a rule, anytime you get anybody with a compulsive aspect of behavior, it's always inflation, always infantile grandiosity, always archetypal contamination, always, period. An archetypal contamination. But the key is to understanding this, and here again, I've worked more on the comparative phenomenology of this, the expressions of the self than a lot have done. I mean, so I don't talk about the self expressing itself, different aspects of it. So you get the person that is really inflated through the king archetype, narcissistic personality disorder. Just imagine the narcissistic personality disorder on his throne, waiting to be adored. Really expects you to adore him. Worship is not necessary, but it helps. But a lot of the time, the narcissistic personality disorder is not into doing. I mean, sometimes they are, but not all the time. A lot of the time, they want you to do for them. And be their gopher. If you are, we'll see later, if you're inflated in the archetype of the lover, you will be promiscuous, and you'll be into compulsive sexuality. Well, compulsive sexuality is inflation, but which has taken the form of the inflation of the lover aspect of the self. And this is true in both females and males. Anytime you see promiscuity, you've got enormous inflation. It is the god or goddess that just can't get enough. It's like the woman has got so much Aphrodite possessing her, she says, so many men, so little time. And the masculine version of that, the Chicago singers sing. But it's always an archetypal inflation. And so when you speak of the archetype of the self, it contains all these. But if you look at any specific human being, you will notice that they manifest the different aspects of it in different ways, except for people who are enormously competent in some ways and have managed to be able to be inflated on all of them at once. And you think, for example, here of John Kennedy, who was possessed with, and his power and his demise both are clearly related to the way in which he was enormously inflated by the possession of this structure. Well, certainly evidence is that he was inflated in that way. but he was inflated in all these other ways too. He obviously didn't think he needed advisors at certain levels because his advisors told him not to be in Dallas without the bubble top on that thought. And one of the things that you get into when you get in this inflation, grandiosity, is you're not going to die. They can't kill me. Feeling of invulnerability. And clearly he had that. The whole fantasy of Camelot was very key, very important, very archetypal, and people may have made jokes about it, but it was very much the psychological organization under which Kennedy and his people operated. But it was also true in a number of the leaders of that time. I mean, anytime you get someone who, begins to put himself forth as the great redeemer, the great leader, there's a real enormous temptation on this. Same thing happened to Gary Hart. Gary Hart was just snapped up with this thing, and there's no way to make any sense out of Hart's behavior and his blindness than to see it as a possession by this thing. I mean, he really felt entitled to be president, and he really did not think that it was possible that anybody had the right to criticize his behavior. And that's just typical of this structure. When you're in this, nobody has the right to criticize you because you are that from which the principles of order emerge. Yeah? Well, yes, it is the archetypal self is, of course, in the psyche, the archetypal structure out of which concepts of order grow. But when the ego identifies with it, then I am saying, I am the source of order. I am the law. Or as the French king said, I am the state. Or the Pope, when he's in his most inflated place, he feels like he is the church. I am the church. And so the archetype of the self contains all of these things in such a powerful combination it's hard for us to even begin to imagine. It's hard for us to even begin to imagine the luminosity and the numinosity of the self. It is not domesticated, no matter how much we talk about it. It is enormously powerful. And when you get close to someone who is mainlining it, they will have an effect on you. That's what Max Weber's whole sociology of the charismatic leader is about. If you encounter a charismatic leader, even if you totally disagree with him and you wouldn't give him a dime, blah, 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 but you're in their presence and they're really a charismatic leader, you will be changed by being in their presence. And it's because they elicit your projection of the archetype of self. It's the only way to explain why people do stupid, inhuman things in response to certain people's leadership. Why they get automatically blind and can't think when they're with certain individuals, charismatic individuals. This is the explanation of charismatic leadership. So anyway, you get a little sense for these two particular structures. You see, they're very important for any man. Let's just stay with it. Any man who's going to be a leader, because if you don't have this king business, then you're not going to have much a sense of concern for the realm. Ownership, you might even say, of the realm. Yes, the word, I think, stewardship is the one that I have found most useful in talking about the positive side of this. The stewardship of the realm is the best way to talk about the virtue of the positive side of the king archetype. And if you don't have the warrior, then you don't have the energy, you don't have the focus, you don't have the capacity to discern where the issues are, who the enemy is, and what you need to do about it. And you will not mobilize. You will tend to be, not think you need help. Thing about the difference, this is one of the people get confused about. They think that the warrior archetype and the hero archetype are the same thing, but they're not. Hero is really more of an archetype of the adolescence. The warrior knows that he can't do it alone. It has to be a team kind of effort. Yeah.
That was exactly what I was meant. Question to plan you. One of the things which I think was to be part of the warrior in order to this relationship to other warriors.
Yep. Because if you're not into making alliances with other warriors, then you're really a grandstander, and you're really a puer into your own glory. Because, and the other side of this is, it's like that little movie, The Dragon Slayer. It's only the uninitiated puer who thinks he's equal to dealing with a dragon by himself. Simply doesn't understand how big the problem is. And once you understand how big the problem is, then you start trying to find your other knights for the round table. Because you know that even if you've got the best there is, that it's still by no means a foregone conclusion what the outcome is going to be. I think particularly of the movie The Magnificent Seven, that is about knighthood, the knight archetype of the warrior. And what was the name of the Japanese version of that? The Seven Samurai. So that's a very important point. And the movie Top Gun deals with the attempt to change a hero into a warrior. So
the warrior is the ultimate end of the task or the goal, and important, or is it less important than the doing, or is it as important, or is it?
Oh, it's very important. It has its total loyalty. See, the whole concept of duty and honor and loyalty and sacrifice comes out of that.
But does it come out of doing that for what they get?
No. To the extent that one is really embodying the positive side of this, it is not self-serving. It certainly gives one a sense of meaning. And so in the sense that you get meaning, if this is meaningful, it's like Viktor Frankl's logotherapy. To the extent that you experience meaning, that's certainly giving you something. But the capacity to be a warrior turns on whether or not you can care enough for something that is totally unrelated to your personal egoistic interest, that you can will the trans-egoic goal. And it's the kind of thing that in our culture we make fun of. The very idea about somebody giving the sacrificing for a trans-egoic goal is considered something that's really foolish now. Nobody in their right mind would do it. And it is precisely that kind of thing that is the most critical thing about our cultural situation. It's very difficult to get people upset about anything now. There is practically nothing that will get people disturbed enough that they would want to sacrifice anything to make a change in it.
And justify means for, let's say, the positive expression of the warrior?
I think that that's where the shadow area, the gray areas come. That's always the issue you get discussing in this whole thing. And, of course, then you get into all of the whole ethics of war, so-called just war theory, and all that sort of thing. I don't think that for the positive side of the warrior, a person that's trying to use this constructively, there's always a limit on the exercise of power. You would never see an arbitrary use of power in anybody that was accessing the positive side of the warrior in a mature way. But willingness to use it in service of the end is certainly also the case. Hence, you get a realism about power. If you know the theologian H. Reinhold Niebuhr, if you've ever heard of him, he would be someone that would be talking about the kind of issues that the ethical issues related there. What do you do when confronted with a Hitler? Do you emulate Chamberlain and hope Hitler is going to be nice? Or do you confront it up front on the bridge of the nose? Okay.
Now, another cliche comes to my mind, and that is, that's not what you then or do's, but it's how you play and then.
That's sports. Sports is a deterioration of the warrior aspect. We have sports rather than warrior. We have athletes rather than warriors. And the idea of the game, is an idea that this is not serious. And it's very interesting how in our time we change everything into sports. It's all the Super Bowl. Everything is the same. The media does it. You have such a socialization of us to respond as if we're responding to a sports event on TV. And so you get starvation, and it's like a sports event on TV. And you get the enormity of the social ills, and it's another event on TV. The media have this amazing capacity to hypnotize people into this. But everything is turned into sports. Very few things are serious in this world. That is for most people.
The warrior
doesn't intend to lose. There is a thing about the warrior, and you see it a lot in Western movies, and there's a lot of this warrior lore in Western movies. If you watch it, if you look very closely and you're looking for the archetype, you can see it. Because the archetype is evident in a number of places. One where he says to the young gunslinger, the old gunslinger says to the young gunslinger, don't pull that thing unless you mean to kill somebody. Now that's warrior talk. That's a very, your power is a serious thing. And unless it's not something to play with, if you are going to wear a gun, you must be prepared to use it should the right situation emerge. And this is at the heart of all initiation motifs in this archetype. Puers do various things on it. They see all power is bad, or all capacity for violence is bad. And you get all sorts of tension between the puer and the senex around this issues. But one of the things about masculine initiation that you see in all these tribes is one of the aspects about becoming a man is becoming dangerous. If you're not dangerous, then you don't have any power. If you have power, you're dangerous. If you have power and you don't know you got it, you're even more dangerous. But if you have power and you don't know when you would use it and when you wouldn't use it, you're also dangerous. See? So the whole issue is, and this is true right across the front, and I would argue this is also true for the feminine initiation, but I don't tend to speak that. But it's all about power and its stewardship. It's stewardship, the appropriate gaining of power and stewarding of power. See? And this is true in all these archetypes. It's true in power as political power. Power as military power. Power as insight power. We'll look at the Magus, who gets power by knowledge. And sexual power. Sexual potency. And it's all a matter, masculine maturation has to do with being empowered and knowing how to use it and when not to use it. Yes.
In introduction, we said you talked about the archetypes being
Amoral. Yes.
that was for the purpose of declining them.
And he's correct.
Not for the purpose of
Identifying with them on.
leaving the archetype.
Well, I think they're natural phenomena. That is to say, you come equipped with this. And sure, the human being is faced with a challenge of using this morally, using the archetypes, accessing, using them morally. But the archetypes themselves, in my perception, do not give a damn whether you use them morally or not. The archetype of the warrior would just as soon be expressed in a Hitler as in a Gandhi. And I think it's very important to get clear about that. Because if you're not clear about that, then it makes you much more vulnerable to possession. And, if you kind of stay away from the archetypal powers, it makes you less dangerous in a way. But if you start getting powerful and creative, then the whole issue of ethics gets enormously focused. Because the more potent you are as a person, the more dangerous you are. And at the same time, the more potential you have for great good. And so the archetype itself, the king, can be Caligula, or it can be expressed like it's being expressed in some ways in the king of Thailand now, who I view as in many ways, a very good king. Nurturing his people, really serving his people in a very significant way. So I'm not putting the archetypes down, I'm just saying archetypes relate to human psyche as they want you. They want all of you. Each one wants all of you. They are very jealous. Archetypes are notoriously imperialistic and jealous of each other. And the more you study people, you will notice the archetypes fighting in their personalities. And the less strength their ego has, the less they are capable of mediating between these claims of these different archetypal structures. You see this in women who have a fight going on between the mother archetype and the Athena archetype. And they don't like each other. And you can even see in the women's experience recently, the Phyllis Schlafly's of this world and the Gloria Steinem's serve as two different archetypal forms of the goddess. And so archetypes are jealous, they're imperialistic, they want everything. And one of the things to do in one's own psychological growth is to ask which archetypal structures have been getting more than their share of me. Because I figure if you ask that question, you can come up with a pretty insightful answer. Yeah, we still got a few minutes. Other comments or questions? Yes.
Do make comments on the impact with current video games where they stress they feel it was a...
I think that would be typical because they're appealing to the adolescent and the queer and the young adult.
One all-powerful figure.
Yeah, right. Sure. Right. Wonderful grandiosity. All they need is me, like that little movie, The Last Starfighter. The whole galaxy of galaxies is in this great war. and they have to come and get me because I know how to play the video game that is based on this particular starship. So I'm drafted, so to speak, intergalactically drafted to win the war. And that's very powerful. You really see the infantile grandiosity there. Other?
It's about to come and we're just practice playing themselves on and
Yeah, I think that I think it's very important. Let me just speak about the man. It's very important for a man to be very centered and secure in his masculinity in order to have a very successful marriage. That is, he needs to have a sense of order that's grounded in himself, in his deep center. And it's this king thing that gives a man that sense of deep security and centeredness, and that if his wife is angry with him, it will not totally unhinge the universe. And he will not have to get very retaliatory fast. Violent men, for example, are men who are not in touch with this in a positive way. They are very fragile and very vulnerable and easily put into a chaotic mode. And so it's very important for married life, and this will be, you can just extrapolate this for the feminine side. It's important for a man to know that he must not look to the woman for the meaning of his existence, for his core, for his center. Because if he's doing that, he's going to ruin the marriage. Because a woman knows that a man shouldn't be looking to her for the core of his existence. And she knows that if he is, there's something very wrong. Any more than she should be looking to him for the core of her deep feminine existence. Same thing would be true about the accessing the archetype of the warrior. You've got to be able to tell what your real enemies are. And you've got not to be possessed by this thing. A lot of marital fighting is when this thing just gets loose, acting out, unconscious. There's much too much. In fact, I think there are a lot of people that foster, a lot of counselors that foster enormously destructive manifestations of the warrior archetype in marriages. Nothing wrong with expressing related anger in a marriage, but encouraging people to just blow their tanks up with every toxic waste that they ever had and dump it on their spouse, that is what I consider malpractice in marriage counseling. And I don't think couples ought to ever be encouraged to blow their tanks and dump it on each other. If they've got a lot of this infantile rage stored up in their toxic waste tanks, they need to be dumping this in the container of a very tight therapeutic relationship. They need to be dumping that on the analyst, not on the spouse. And so if you're not related to this warrior thing in a healthy way, you'll be constantly gunning for the spouse, turning the spouse into the enemy. It's very common to turn the spouse into the enemy when the spouse is not the enemy, should not be seen as the enemy. And there are enemies. I'm a great believer that there are real enemies in this world. Otherwise, the world wouldn't be going down the tubes in so many ways if the human race didn't have real enemies. So, but that's just some of the ways. There are a lot of other ways, I'm sure. We'll talk more about that next week. Other comment, yeah.
That's when a human Jew, a while back that I read that to punch the lion and the war.
Mm-hmm. Somebody in one of my classes brought that.
Like a description of Illuminati.
Yeah. Yeah. And the intimacy among men. That's really it. And the
guy was saying that people don't want to talk about Vietnam, not because it was so terrible, but because it indicted someone. Which looked real odd one time. it was like it was such a big experience that they sort of said, he said, we know that we'll never experience the intensity of our.
Yeah. Well, see, when you're mainlining the archetypal, you feel like a God. And the hardest thing to do with somebody who has tasted it is to wean them off of that, ain't it? Because once you had a little, it's like the tiger that ate a human. You know something. And what you know is what it's like to be, what I would say, it's not as fancy as to be an archetype, but it's to be divine. And there is something very, very divine about, you see it portrayed. That's why people hated, a lot of people hated that movie Apocalypse Now, but that guy that made that movie had a sense for this. Those choppers come in on that little village, strafing and napalming, and then they got Robert Duvall, an AirCal officer, who is just loving this and just sets his teeth on edge. He's loving it so much. I love the smell of that burning napalm, like burning flesh. That's too close to the truth, and that is there is an excitement. You got to read Nietzsche to get it. Nietzsche understood this, and that's what drove him crazy. He had a taste of it. Übermensch, the Superman. Well, Superman is simply a man that's gotten into the numinosity of the archetype, and once you taste it, you got very few options. You can totally shut down as a defense against it, which is what a lot of Vietnam War vets do. I'm a zombie. Well, I'm a zombie because if I'm not a zombie, I may kill your ass. And I love it. See, so it's better for me to be a zombie and depressed. That is defending against the manic side of that. You can work on your spirituality, and this is where spirituality comes in, and it's very key. To just see what you're talking about here. If you want to traffic with the archetypal, you better work on a spirituality. Something that enables you to honor the archetypal without identifying with it. That's what spiritualities of all traditions are about. You've got to be able to honor it without identifying with it. If you don't honor it, then you think you are it. You show me somebody that's a militant atheist, and I'll show you a God. May not know it, but there's God walking around there. See?
Quite unintentionally in Europe. I discovered this a couple of years ago. I went to London, and I went to St. Paul's Cathedral. Beautiful big cathedral, stained glass, gold, and military heroes in statues around the periphery. Mm-hmm. The two were part of this home. That they were treated together in this culture, and because of our separation of church and state, we separate those two, and we don't deal with them together.
Well, we do, but not very. We sort of get around with it. Arlington Cemetery. Arlington National Cemetery is a place where they're very much together. And in World War II, they tended to be very closely together. But the Vietnam War split it very heavily. One thing that's interesting to do is to do an archetypal analysis in the 60s. What happened to this archetype of the warrior in the 60s? Because it did split, all over the place. It wasn't held together. But anyway, so you can work on the spirituality. I think it's very key. See, the Jungians talk about what? The ego archetypal self-axis. Well, we throw that around like that's, well, what do you got to do? Well, you just got to develop an ego self-axis. Well, what does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what it means, and we'll stop formally, and then we can chat. Those of you that have to run can get up and take off. But we'll be working with this same kind of thing next week, but here's what's involved in ego archetype axis. See, as long as you're depressed and out of touch with creativity, you don't need much in the way of careful discipline with regard to the archetypal realm because you're not plugging it in, and you feel like an ordinary schmuck. And you project all this numinous stuff on other people. That's the way most human beings throughout all history have handled it. It's a safer way for some people. It's not safe if you're a Jew or anybody else that somebody wants to sacrifice. But if you're just an ordinary person in Christian culture, then you project it on the Pope and you project it on the blah, 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 and then they carry it for you and you don't have to deal with it. Let the priest handle it. He's up there dealing with all that hot stuff. He's got to worry about the radiation, not me. I say, as long as you got that, you're kind of okay. But once you start getting the idea that you're in touch with the archetypal, then you got big problems. Because that stuff, here's what you got to get about the archetypal self. It is enormously tempting, and it is enormously powerful, and it has a siren's call. All that stuff about the siren's call, the archetypal realm goes, come on over here, come on to my house, you know. I'm going to give you something. I'm going to make you great, you know. And it's not passive. The archetypal, don't ever forget this. The archetypal is not passive. It's very assertive. It's out to get you. It wants you. The two key words of the archetypal self are more and better. It wants more from you and wants you to do it better. It wants you to do it better yesterday, perfectly, without effort. And if you listen to your critic, who's talking to you about why you didn't do it better yesterday and without effort, you know who you're listening to. It's the archetypal self talking to you, putting you down. But in any case, once you connect with it, it's very difficult not to get possessed by it. Take any cocaine addict. Then the dangerous thing about coke is it just plugs you right in to the archetypal self. And you're wonderful when you're in that. And once you have been wonderful, it's not enough to just be ordinary. See? And that's why cocaine is so dangerous. And what it does to you is it puts you into your Mr. Wonderfulness. And you don't need any sleep. You don't need, any rest. You don't need anybody. In fact, you're God. And the archetypal self can live forever like that, but the human being can't. And that's what is so dangerous about it. Eh? Oh, eh? Sure. But this is so, and all compulsions, every compulsion has behind it an archetypal self-structure that is caressing. And I don't care what kind of compulsion it is. You got compulsive behavior, it's the archetypal self pressing. And if it's really up close to you where you can see it, it lights you up like a Christmas tree. And then you don't like disidentifying with it. Even if it's running you down, you don't like disidentifying with it. Because it's one thing to criticize yourself from the point of view of a God. It's closer to being God than just accepting one's humanness. And so staying human is this enormously difficult task when you're relating to this archetypal self. And nobody tells us about this very much. But why spirituality? Well, that is another way to talk about working on the ego self axis, working on an optimal relationship to the self, to the archetypes, so that they do for you what they are designed, I think, to do, which is to provide you with energy and vision, sense of meaning. If you're really relating to these archetypes of the masculine, you will have energy and you will not be bored you will have a sense of meaning. Then that's the good news. Bad news is if they have you, you will act that stuff out in ways that are destructive probably for you and others. Many great artists acted out in ways destructive for themselves and others. Now we've got to stop there. I'll stick around and chat a few minutes. But next week we'll look at the archetype of the magician and the archetype of the lover. We'll look for more detail. We talked about 2 archetypes last week, and tonight we're going to go into the other 2 of the 4 that I think are fundamentally important for understanding the mature masculine, or what I call the masculine potential. Now, as you know, there are many archetypes of the masculine which are present in the psyche and which inform a lot of our behavior and which have an appropriate place, such as the trickster, the puer, the hero, etc., etc. But none of those are really archetypal paradigms for the potential masculine. They have their appropriate place, and in another setting I could talk about exactly how they work. But these 4 are images of what can be and ways of thinking about what is going wrong when things don't work, which is most of the time in human history and culture. And tonight, last week we talked about the king and the warrior, and tonight we're going to talk about the magus, or the magician, and the lover, the archetypal lover. And what I propose to do is to jump into these and to I think the best thing for me to do is to talk about them both before the break. And then let's have a break and then come back and discuss this and elaborate it as far as we can before our time is up. If that's okay with you, we jump in. Now, when I started off, I was talking to you about the dynamics of transformative space. It's very important in talking about the magician archetype to understand that this is the archetype of awareness, all awareness, what Jung would call consciousness, getting conscious, enhancing your consciousness. If Jungian psychology has an ethics of consciousness, it is grounded in the way in which this particular archetypal pattern potentially can be embodied in everyone, not just the person functioning as a magician. Magician is a social role. It's the same thing as ritual elder. In my personal view, the archetype of the magician is the covering archetype for a lot of other patterns which you hear people talk about. Let me just list a bunch of them that I think operate underneath this. The wise old man. I don't know why Jungians have continued to talk about the wise old man, because there are a lot of wise old men that are not magicians and they do not function like a wise old man in the Jungian literature. When you're talking about the wise old man in the Jungian literature, you're talking about somebody who is serving as some sort of spirit guide, spiritual guide, some sort of cycle pump role. If you're doing active imagination with this figure, you're using this person as one who is guiding you on your own individuation process. So to the extent that this person is serving as a spiritual guide, it comes under this magus archetype, and I'll explain to you why that is a little bit. But Jung talks about the archetype of the spirit coming in the form of he says other places, for wise old man. Well, spirit archetype meaning again, often little men who show up in some way as helpers or guides. But the spirit archetype can be manifest in all sorts of symbols, in all sorts of dream images. But it always carries this role of the magus. In some places in the collected work, Jung comes right out and talks about this as the magician. You hear a lot of people talk in contemporary Jungian circles, particularly pop Jungian circles, about the shaman. Well, the shaman is simply one form of the magician. It is a form of certain group of Siberian peoples, and there's some other, they're Korean, it's a form in Korean culture, it's a form in some South American cultures, but it's one expression of this particular pattern. The sorcerer, the brujo, the medicine man. Contrary to what a lot of the Christians like to say, this is the archetype behind the priest. There's not a distinction between priest and magician. That's Christian propaganda. The magician, the priest, when he functions as a priest and he's competent as a priest, liturgically, he's functioning as a magician. He's not doing, hopefully, demonic magic, but sometimes you do. All healers sometimes practice shadow magic. But the distinctions that were made by Christian anthropologists early in the 19th century and throughout the 19th century between magic and religion are bogus distinctions. They do not hold up to careful phenomenological analysis. Most of those things were by Protestants who tend to be ritually tone deaf. I'm a Protestant, so I can talk about us. And they would tend to treat Catholic religion as magic anyway. So we just need to be clear about that kind of distinction. Is really a very dated, culturally biased, sort of colonialistic, chauvinistic, all those things. Anyway. So you can go on, and there are female versions of all these. You see it in the priestess, in the tarot deck, etc., etc. But in contemporary neo-paganism, your witch, your priestess, etc., etc., are expressions of the female side of this same pattern. Well, you see, that's the thing that I think is confusing about the way a lot of people talk about this. The synex, in the most positive aspect in a transformative process, would be this. But you can have all kinds of synexes that have nothing to do with transformation. And therefore, I would prefer to say that the magus includes some expressions of the synex, but not to confuse the two any more than we would confuse the king archetype and the magus. Because the king is also sometimes a synex. See? So for all of the way that we Jungians talk about phenomenology of religion and comparative mythology and all these things, we're not very careful about this stuff, and we don't look carefully at the progress that can be made in ordering these things, and we need to do a better job ordering them. That's why I think it's important. It's very important to think about different roles. Think about role theory. What is it this person's about? What are they in charge of? Why is this here in the psyche? Well, if you remember that tripartite scheme that I talked about last time in transformation, the thing that's known in anthropology is preliminal, and then liminal, and postliminal. Let me give you the three things that always come together when this thing is appropriately constellated. When this archetype is constellated, you will have two other archetypal forms always constellated with it. The archetype of initiation will always be with it, and the archetype of sacred space will always be with. How is that? Well, it's really very simple. Don't make this more complicated than it really is. Just look at the up here. Sacred space never exists except in the context of initiation, transformation. That is, it's a special space that exists for the purpose of change, deep structural change in personality. And so this part, the middle phase in a transformative process, is always, to the extent that human beings can muster it, is always what Eliade calls sacred space, or what Victor Turner calls liminal space. Now, so when you think of the archetype of initiation, it always contains a movement into this kind of space, all sorts of education, humiliation, ritual wounding, all sorts of scarification, all sorts of humiliation processes that are involved in the scraping you down to the bone, dismembering you, and then reassembling you. Come out the other side. Okay. So, what is the relationship of the magus to this? It's always present. Well, it is the one that's supposed to be looking after this process. The one that's supposed to be stewarding this process, minding the store. Now, this is why when you get into a midlife crisis, you start looking for a special person as the answer. Now, a lot of people get confused about the nature and purpose of this special person, but they always look for special person. Always look for a magic person. Get in a midlife crisis, you're going to be looking for a magic person, just like that. You're also looking for a special space, and you're looking for that esoteric whatever. Esoteric knowledge. You can think it's sexual knowledge you're looking for. You can think it religious knowledge. You can think it professional knowledge. But you've got a fantasy going of esoteric special knowledge that you don't have and they got, and you're looking for it. You become a quester, in other words. The quester is constellated when you get into a transformation process. And you're looking for two things. You're looking for this space, and you're looking for the person that embodies and stewards it. Now, that is an actual ritual process in human culture forever, including now. And all you got to do is study anthropology and the history of religions cross-culturally, and you always see it. It is always there. There is no such thing as a human culture that doesn't have this. Now, in modernity, where people are so ritually tone deaf, they don't talk about it this way, but you see the same thing. Your most secular, most, to his mind or her mind, rigorous behavioral psychotherapist, behavioral psychologist and psychotherapist that doesn't even believe in the psyche, when they do therapy, they are presenting themselves in the guise, in the persona of the ancient sorcerer. Now, most behavioral therapists hadn't had enough education in terms of culture to know that, and would be insulted if you said, well, you're functioning as a magician, and from what I can tell from your practice, you're a damn good one. Well, there are many damn good ones. I'm real impressed with behavioral therapists dealing with certain types of people, certain types of problems. There are some behavioral treatment schemes now of borderline personality that make us psychoanalytic types look sick. So I'm not knocking behavioral therapy. I'm just saying that even if you function out of something that's supposedly totally scientific, nothing to do with ritual, religion, or anything, you inevitably end up operating under this paradigm. So this paradigm doesn't have anything to do with Jungian psychology. It's just the way human transformative processes operate. And this is true whether you're Freudian, a Jungian, a behaviorist, a gestaltist, etc. All this is the archetypal pattern for psychotherapy, wherever it's practiced. It's also the paradigm for spiritual direction.
I thought all these people are going to be
Same type of thing. It's some more of this New Age stuff. Wow. I appreciate a lot about the New Age. The New Age people are much more sensitive to a lot of this kind of issue. In fact, most of the creative work that's been done on reappropriating ritual process in the context of transformation has been done by New Age types. That's the good news. The bad news is that they do not have the sense of evil and the shadow the Jungians do. And if you don't have a sense of the power shadow, and you're a Gestalt therapist, or some of the to the left of the Gestalt therapist on this New Age business, why, everything is sweetness and light, and I'm just out here trying to help people, and we're going to put everybody on these channels, and these channels are going to lead people to the new redemption. You know, it won't cost you as much as a decent shrink, and get it cheap. Read New Age magazine. And the problem is this problem that we're dealing with in these two sessions about the difficulty of that archetype ego axis. I was thinking for, coming up here now, there's some things I got to make sure I've communicated. One is the seductive, aggressive quality of the archetype. I don't know whether I had sufficiently tried to communicate that to you if you hadn't got that. But these archetypes are aggressive. They're not passive. They're aggressive. They want you. They want all of you. Each one wants all of you. They're imperialistic. And not only that, they're good at it. Because once you get in contact with numinous energies coming off of any of these, the seductive power of it is enormous. And it has the capacity to overwhelm the critical powers of your ego more than practically any modern type can understand. There is a contagion aspect. Now, Jung understood this. This stuff is contagious. The best metaphor I know to use now is radiation. This stuff, you touch it, it's on you. You get close to it, and if you had psychological Geiger counters, they would go wild. But you see, it's hard to communicate this stuff. But the point being that a lot of these New Age types just cuddle up to this stuff like it's just, nothing. Well, the only problem is that the grandiose self gets enormously overstimulated. It possesses the ego. And once it possesses the ego, as we'll see with both this one and the lover, number one, you're not likely to know when you're doing other people damage. You're so wonderful. And they're so lucky to be with you. And number two, when you do know you're doing them damage, you really don't give a damn. Because it's practically impossible to be coming off of the grandiosity of an archetypal inflation, archetypal possession, and have any ethics at all. That is why the narcissist has no moral concerns. Can't have any moral, because he's God. And it's not the God of the Judeo-Christian prophetic tradition. This is the God of I'm God, I do what I please. And so that is the important thing to get at, and the reason why you need a magus who is not an evil sorcerer is because there's nothing more inflating than being in this role anyway. Nobody in this role avoids being inflated pretty good bit of the time. See, I include clergy, all healer types. Guggenbill Craig's Power in the Helping Profession book gets at that, and all you got to do is just read that. Power, Shadow, in the Helping Professions. Medicine is amazing, the way in which it operates in medicine today, generally. And the mystical, magical power of that is, and our transference to the medical profession is the amazing thing that we don't line them up and shoot them against the wall, all the poor people. Over here, all these hospitals closing on the south side. It's amazing. You know, the uncritical attitudes toward the medical establishment, and it is because of an archetypal transference. If you don't have that archetypal transference, then you treat people like they're just ordinary humans trying to make a buck. See? And if we could look at psychotherapists and MDs like that, we would treat them different, including yours truly. Now, so you need somebody that understands this radiation. And you need somebody that knows how to help you get into this thing and in as optimal a way as possible, and to get out of it in as optimal a way as possible. And that is a huge, tall order. It's a much larger order than most psychotherapists know. And that's because it is so easy to get into the evil sorcerer position as a therapist. I mean, when you look at the pressure on a therapist to think about his or her own self-aggrandizement rather than the welfare of their client, if you look at that honestly, then it's amazing how much good therapy happens. But this person is somebody you got to understand. When you got somebody that is responsibly carrying this, it is an enormous moral achievement. And I didn't mean perfectly carrying it. Nobody carries it perfectly. It's just good enough to carry it in a good enough way. And if you want some idea of the figures, you get the APA reports on unprofessional behavior among psychologists, which are there in the American Psychologist to read. And the unpublished reports on the unprofessional behavior of clergy of all stripes. So the task, however, is to accept the archetypal transfer. Now, this is coming out of the unconscious megas in the psyche of the individual. To the extent that you are really operating out of your unconscious, this thing is unconscious in you and me. So in an archetypal transference, we try to put it on somebody that will hold it. Now, that transference itself, the placing of this projection onto a healer, whoever they are, that creates this transitional space. Even the Freudians admit it now. Some of the best work on this right now is being done by Freudians, particularly those influenced by D.W. Winnicott. If you want to read a good Freudian treatment of this whole thing I'm talking about here, read Boundary and Space by Davis and Walbridge. It's a study of the significance of Winnicott's work. And it's about this transitional space that opens out in the transfer, through the transfer. And there is somebody tell me the name of that anthology that came out not long ago honoring Winnicott. Between Reality and Fantasy, I think was the name of it. It was reviewed in the San Francisco Jung Institute Library Journal. But it treats this whole special space quality from that Freudian point of view. So we're not the only ones that are seeing this. This is not a Jungian thing. This is a human thing. And we still are working at it. But this is, if you were like so many people and you got into the Jung's collected works and you came upon all this stuff about alchemy and transference, and I think, what in the world is alchemy got to do with transference? This man has completely lost it. Well, it's got everything to do with transference. He was the pioneer who understood that transference is not, as Freud thought, simply a repetition of an old object relationship inappropriately in the present. It is a field, the psychosocial I think, biosocial field that's created when this archetypal transference relationship is constellated. Now, if some of you know Heinz Kohut's work here in Chicago, the great self-psychologist, his discussions of the different types of transference that occur are apropos to this. An idealizing transfer is really the transference of omega on the therapist. You have to be able to idealize this therapist to a certain degree, or you will not put your archetypal transference in their keeping. And if they break your trust enough, you won't really invest this in them. And if you've been in therapy a good while and nothing is happening, and you can tell nothing is really happening, and you don't have much intense affect about your therapist, if there's no real feeling of this kind of stuff opening out, then this archetypal transference is not occurring. Now, it could be because of your own wounds and your capacity to trust. That is one of the things that happens in this. If somebody is really failed early in life, it becomes harder to project this. And that's why borderline, for example, are so hard to treat. Because a borderline has a terrible time putting this archetypal transference on a therapist and keeping it there. The therapist is often not good enough to hold it. So the critical issue is, can the person who is playing this social role, number one, do they know what's going on here? That when someone is idealizing them, that may be just exactly the right thing that needs to happen. And, it's funny, among a lot of clergy today, if the laity idealizes the clergyman, a lot of the theological education has taught this clergyman that they shouldn't accept this idealization. I'm just like you. We're all in this together. I'm just as crazy as you are. Well, of course, all that's true. But that's not what the person needs to hear, probably, right at that minute. So the clergy have been taught to do this psycho-spiritual striptease. I don't have anything to offer you. Honest to God, And that's supposed to be virtuous. But in fact, it's completely wrong in terms of anything significant interpersonally happening, in terms of transformative process. And that's why so many of them go to secular therapists all the time. That's why they're reading. But anyway, so you can refuse the transference for whatever reason. Kohut says one of the reasons that people refuse this, therapists refuse this, is because their own grandiosity is still so primitive that when the analysand idealizes them, it stimulates the grandiosity and it presses the therapist toward a manic place that they can't really handle. And so the therapist, because of their own instability, reject the archetypal transference, and of course will make some rationalization about why they're doing it. When in fact, it's simply because they have got so much untransformed grandiosity themselves that they can't handle it being stimulated. So we know, in other words, we know a lot now, a lot more than I have time to talk about the way this transference operates. Now, I take a position that's different from a lot of Jungians about this stuff. See, I believe you can make a distinction between personal and archetypal transference. This is not a personal transference. This doesn't have a thing to do with you personally. This has to do with an archetypal transference that is a sine qua non if you're going to have a deep structural change. if the person in therapy is going to have a deep structural change. Now, behavioral changes can occur without this. You know, all therapy has some kind of teaching involved in it. There is social learning going on. And but from a Jungian point of view, here's the problem. Here's the concern. It's not just Jungian. Also, the really sophisticated Freudians understand this stuff too. People like Harold Searles and Robert Lang. And that is to say, you can have a lot of therapy that goes on for a long time that is what Robert Lang calls lie therapy. That is, it's not deep. It is not structural change. It looks serious, but it isn't. And that occurs when this archetypal transference is not in place and fairly consolidated. Now, we can later, if you have questions, more further questions about that in our discussion, you can raise those, and I'll be happy to elaborate. But that is the social process and social purpose of this type of thing. That is, this thing, as all therapy, is in a human bio-psycho-cultural ritual process. It is not isolated. And that is the way you must understand this archetype if you understand it appropriately. It's inevitably social. Now, but let's just look at the individual psyche now. Good. What happens to an individual who is out of touch with this thing? Consciously, it's not in touch with it consciously. Well, what happens to a lot of people is they just don't have much self-awareness at all, or self-consciousness in the positive sense of that at all. They live their lives, do their jobs, have their families, and they don't think much about what it's all about or what the meaning of it is until something catastrophic comes crashing in to raise the question of what's this all about. But there are many. It's amazing how many people. I mean, if you work with business people, successful ones, some of you are consultants, I know, and work in that area. I do a good bit of that sort of thing too. But you have some amazingly sophisticated people, sophisticated in terms of business, sophisticated in terms of culture in some way. I mean, real connoisseurs of the art, but who never really thought much about what made them who they are now, where they're going, what is the meaning of their life. What the religionists always talked about is vocatio, or vocation. What is the purpose of my life? Jung talks about individuation is becoming the person that you uniquely are to be. That is a psychological version of the Presbyterian idea of providence. That is, there is some sense that there is a particular meaning for my life, and it's amazing how many people, well, as Socrates put it, live the unexamined life. When this thing is not constellated and consciously related to, that will be the case. And the question of meaning will be related to at several steps removed. And like the person will be involved, for example, in the arts, and may be actually fairly competent painter, or in some cases a fairly competent writer, but have very little sense of what makes them tick. In fact, what is happening a lot of the time is that their particular creativity is being used as a holding environment. It's being used, the art is being used to contain them And without their art, they would be crazy. Okay? This is very common. This is your workaholic pattern and other expressions too. You know, you let the work contain you. Well, the work shouldn't be the container. Not in the spiritual sense or the psycho-spiritual sense. The work should be an expression of one's mature creativity. It shouldn't be the container and excuse for not being conscious. Follow that? Okay. Now, but this thing gets constellated always in life crises. You got a life crisis? Bam, this thing gets constellated. Now, it doesn't mean that you're going to find somebody for a transformative process. What a lot of people decide they're shamans at this point. You get it? They have a life crisis, and all of a sudden they have a mystical experience, an experience of the sacred, and they find that they are the answer. Well, we knew the world had all these problems, and now the answer is here. Moi. I am it. And they're all over the place. The New Age community is full of them, but they don't have a corner on it. The fundamentalists are this way, Well, I had my life crisis, then I met Jesus, and now I'm a preacher, and I've got a television show, and I've got this ministry going, and I can play a hot rock and roll country piano. My name is, yes, and I'm very envious. You have to excuse my country western shadow envies the hell out of Jimmy Swaggart and his cousins, Jerry Lee Lewis and Mickey Gilley. But the point of it is that you look, see now, just look at that Swaggart phenomenon and try to muster a little empathy. I mean, I like the man. I love the man because he's very much like my shadow, see. But, and as I say, his cousins, I used to be a rock and roller back in the early days, but the thing about it is you get these people that have this experience, crisis, illumination, quote, offer themselves as the Savior, Redeemer, or their agent. But nothing has really changed structurally. In other words, what is supposedly awareness is pseudo-awareness. And then what you get is these people acting out all over the place. What you've got is a mega inflation. And we have seen a lot of that this year. We talked about Gary Hart last week about the way you get when you're in that king thing and you get inflated. Well, when you're in this thing and you get inflated, you're Jim Baker, Jimmy Swaggart, Fritz Perl, Carl Jung. See, we don't know about Freud because his disciples had enough sense to hide all the papers and put them under lock and key until pretty soon. We're supposed to get into the archives before long when we'll know what really happened between Freud and his sister-in-law. But, and some of his other disciples. But this inflation that occurs, read William James Varieties of Religious Experience. If you hadn't read that, get it and read it. One thing you'll notice, when does religious experience occur? In the middle of crisis. James doesn't pick that out, but you just study those lives. He doesn't talk about the way in which it is fundamentally a crisis experience. Very few people have any religious experience except in crisis. The ones that think they're not in crisis are in the worst crisis. They're the ones that are really trying to hold it all together to keep from having a real disintegration. Inversion experiences, all that stuff exists in this context. What is the problem? Well, when you get real regressed under a catastrophic crisis, whether it's an externally caused crisis or an internally caused crisis. You know what I mean, internally caused crisis? Your childhood was so bad that you've got a psychosis waiting for a place to happen. See? And your poor little ego is under pressure from both sides, the outside world and the inside world. And the pressure you get into this crisis, you're very likely to think you're a mystic messiah. And you're very likely to think that you don't need to go to school and get any kind of training. You don't need to have any kind of initiatory process. You've already had it directly through the psyche, through the numinous experience. Well, Jung was right. He talked about the way in which all healing really comes through the numinous. All true healing comes through the numinous. What he talked about in other places, but didn't talk about it as much or as clearly, is that the numinous without containment destroys you. And I would want to put my own personal view is always destroys you if it's out of containment. The numinous relativizes your ego when you encounter it. Encounter it, it melts down. You have a meltdown when you encounter the numinous. It melts down ego structures. If you have a vessel to hold you while you're not in ego structures, then that's transformation, or usually can be. If you don't have a vessel, then it can be the annihilation of the self and the replacement of that with an imposter personality who thinks he's God's gift to the world, or she thinks she's God's gift to the world. It is not the true self of the individual at all. It's what Jung would talk about as an archetypal possession. So in other words, this thing is in the psyche. Its purpose, its positive purpose, is as the archetype of awareness. When you develop your capacity to contain your functioning historically present and reflections on the future in a reflective vessel, and you work with this enough so that you feel that you've got this pretty integrated and you've got your own systematic spirituality set up so you can continue this without being in a therapeutic vessel. Then you've got this megas thing conscious, you've got it fairly integrated, and you're on an ongoing relationship with it through active imagination, probably in the context of some community, and if you're a religious person, in some form of meditation and prayer. If you... Now that is optimum, that's about as optimum as you get. Notice, community, not private. Privacy leads to inflation, always. Von Franz points it out. You stay alone, you're inviting Satan. And so the healthy expression of this thing is after one has developed some sophisticated personal awareness, that is continued to be developed in some context of some community that is fairly conscious and striving to be more conscious. And in the context of some form of human spirituality. That would be my position. That was certainly Jung's position. So, now what we got? Then we got to move on. The archetype is the archetype of awareness. If it's developed, made conscious, and related to in the course of individuation, then you become a really reflective, conscious person, and the ethical awareness and consciousness come with it. If you run into the numinous without adequate helpers, the chances are that you're going to think you're a magus. And again, there are a lot of people that are looking for such spiritual freebasing as it. And they go around looking for it all the time, and they're not satisfied unless they get it. And a lot of your retreat experiences and that sort of thing are in this category. And now there are a lot of retreat experiences I would include in that. Retreat experience is fine as long as you've got a framework for it to fit into. You've got responsible leaders, and you got some place to come and be debrief after the retreat experience and help keep all those demons that came out during the retreat experience sort of contained and worked with. Okay. And in terms of the process of healing, the healing process, either in therapy or in spiritual direction, that whole business of sacred space is key, cannot be ignored. Hopefully, this summer, I will be able to put the last touches on a manuscript I have now called The Magician and the Analyst, Ritual, Process, and Psychotherapy, and hopefully that'll be published sometime early next year. So I've elaborated that a lot there. Now, let's save our questions about this, and let me talk a little bit for about 15 minutes about the lover, and then let's take a break, and then we'll come back and you can engage me and we'll discuss this sort of things. Now here is where we should understand the meaning of seduction. But here, it's even more difficult to be conscious, I think, than probably any other, because we're all so wounded in this area of our psyches from very early on. It's very difficult to find anyone who is either aware or honest or both, who will not admit to having some very serious difficulties in their first love affair. That is, with mom and dad. And the whole field now of the study of narcissistic psychopathology is really a study of wounds in the capacity to love. And so let me just start off by saying this archetypal potential is there for individuals to be able to develop mature, responsible object relationships, which are very, very loving, capable of differentiation, capable of having an object that is not me, and capable of allowing that object to be a free, independent center of initiative. And yet, even though, damn you, you are free and can choose to leave me anytime you please, I still think you're so delightful that I want to do what I can to be in relationship with you. Now that, I hope you were listening carefully to what I was saying, because it's very difficult to find people that can do this. Just look around in our culture, in the world, and you and me. Because of our needs. Our needs are so enormous. For the magic lover that we had in relatively good enough form between 1 and 4, that we have enormous difficulties in being an actually human lover in the present, because we bring that enormous archetypal need for the magic lover to our present relationships, and we put enormous demands on our relationships to be things that a human can never be. Period. Can never be. Should never be. When you study the object relations literature, what you find is that most of the literature is a study of using people as need gratifiers. That what we major in is using other people and exploiting them as need gratifiers. And it takes tremendous human development to get to where you can only use your partner some of the time. That's the goal. The goal as a human being is to get to where you regress into your neediness much less of the time. And that you try, when you are really regressed into your neediness, that you try to find somebody else who is a megas to put that neediness on and not your partner. Follow? What is so damaging to human relationships is expecting them to be this magician container that is not ever to be. See, the mother transference, for example, that we get in so many of our relationships, men put the mother transference on the wife, but the wife also puts the mother transference on the husband. And this mother transference is a quest, archetypally speaking, often for the megas. So, archetypally, the potential is to be able to get to the point that you can take delight in and appreciate the other as other. See what is in fact there without reference to my needs. It is only at that point that you can really get into a sort of a play mode with the other. Narcissistic sexuality, where you have the massive wounding in the lover, you have the archetypal lover coming in and possessing the individual. The archetypal lover, when it possesses an individual, makes it impossible to value the other as a human much. Now, the interesting thing about the way this works is that when one is influenced by the archetypal lover, it enhances it. It turns up the power on the perception. It really affects the consciousness in a powerful way. You know about this from one of the times you've been in love. Turns up the power. Now, there are a lot of people that say that it's infatuation and not love. They are wrong. It is love, but it's not human in the strict sense. It's archetypal. That is to say, when you get a Don Juan, or the female version, say, for example, a borderline with histrionic qualities, or a histrionic with a underlying borderline organization. That's what we say technically. It's the woman that's trying to sleep with all the men in Chicago before time runs out. Now, it'd be very easy to see that as not having any real positive erotic component, but I think that's wrong. Because this is Aphrodite in a woman. And when you see promiscuity in a man, like the movie with Burt Reynolds, the man who loved women, well, that character did love women, plural. The quality of the archetypal lover, whether it manifests in a man or a woman, is truly that they do love them. When they look, they do see beauty. There is something that is magical about the person that they're perceiving. Does that mean that the consciousness of the person seeing them is bad? No, not at all. Blake is right. Most of the time, our perception is so bad at seeing beauty that most of the time our sensors for beauty are way, way down. And when you're in touch with this archetype, it turns it up. And when you look, you can see beauty. And things do glisten. And the glistening is in the object. It's not just in the eye of the beholder. See, that's what artists understand. A lot of writers. You take an artist I mean, a great painter or a great writer, and you look through their eyes at the world. And the world they're seeing is a hierophany. It's a revelatory landscape. And see, the thing is that it really is probably that beautiful. It's just that most of the time we are wounded in that sector of our capacity to perceive. It's one of the qualities of being narcissistically wounded. You get bored easily. It's a litmus test. Show me somebody that gets bored easily. I'll show you somebody that's got severe narcissistic pathology. They may function great, but if you get bored easily, something wrong with perception. Lots of reasons to be tired in this world, but not very many to be bored. One is bored. It's very difficult for that individual to have an appreciative consciousness. And there's where the key of this. The virtue. What is the virtue of this archetype? The virtue is an appreciative consciousness. The capacity to take delight in. Think about those words. To take delight in. Now ask yourself, what do you take delight in? If you're like a lot of men, and you've got the money, you take delight in your car. You look at that machine, it's just a joyous thing to behold. It's a hierophany. I mean, men that are into their BMWs, their Mercedes, or if you're like me, an old Cadillac convertible. You just think those things are a thing of beauty and a joy forever. But that's one expression of it. And it comes out, and you just look at somebody's life, and you just pay attention. What is it that delights them? It really delights them. That's where this archetype's manifesting. What do Jungians call that for a man? We have a way of talking in our subculture. We have a way of talking about that. What do we say? Yeah, he's carrying his anima, right? Now think about the meaning of that. If this car is carrying my anima, the anima is feminine. The archetypal context is I want to make love to it. What they're saying. Well, they're right. That's right. But you got to get your mind around what this is being said here. When you put the anima in something, it means, this is not something that you just kind of sit back poised about. I mean, you've got some libido flowing here. And you want it. Well, it's something that if you have half a chance, you're going to snuggle up to and partake of. And this is a thing that is hot with humans. And again, the more wounded you are as a child, the less comfortable you will be with this archetypal potential for delight. And as an adult, you will be more bored, more chronically depressed, not manicky. Now, if you're manicky, you're more in touch with it. Manic types are more into their disordered loves. Okay. It's not healthy love, but it's certainly love. So, if you talk about the potential, it is this appreciative consciousness, the capacity to take delight in. If you study world religion, almost all of the traditions have got a representation of the god as the archetypal lover. What is the rule? The god is always promiscuous. loves everybody. Shiva, Krishna, and the gopis. You know that wonderful, I've got in my office, one of my offices, one of these canvas paintings with Krishna, the Lord Krishna, the Dark Lord, who is dancing with all the young cowmaids, and they all think that they're dancing alone with him. They're so enchanted, but he's got them all out there now. And in the Christian tradition, you see the same thing, Jesus the lover. And in those old evangelical songs that all the contemporary Christians are embarrassed about, it's just out there, right out front. Jesus, lover of my soul, let me to thy bosom fly. You know, I walk in the garden with him. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Melt me and mold me after thy will. While I am waiting, yield it still. Archetypal love. And the one that's my favorite is, there's a poem, a medieval Hindu love poem, written to Krishna, known as the Gita Govinda, or the love song of the Dark Lord. And it is the love poetry, ostensibly, between Krishna and Radha. And it literally drips with passion. And it is, frankly, unabashedly, a tremendous aspect of Hindu spirituality. Hindus love talking about the love nectar of the gods. And that's this archetypal lover aspect of the sacred and aspect of the archetypal realm. So what happens to humans is, when you have lived a dry and wooden, boring, depressed existence, you are just unconsciously uttering prayers for the divine lover to come down and possess you. Come on down. And you take somebody, you get a relationship, a marriage, in which there is no archetypal lover stuff present. And that aspect of the divine is not consciously encouraged by both parties. Then you have a very dangerous situation in which Aphrodite is going to manifest either in the wife with some other man, or in the husband in projected form on some other woman, because this aspect of the divinity is going to manifest somewhat. So, in human life, yeah.
May do that to their daughters if it's not happening in your solitude?
Well, that's what happens in child abuse. In child abuse, the spouses have this locked out in their relationship, usually because of narcissistic wounds. Usually, although you'll hear all these people say, well, the research shows that people that abuse children are not mentally ill. They simply don't have any understanding of this kind of narcissistic pathology at all. But what happens is this archetypal reality gets locked out of the relationship, and so it starts getting projected. And usually the father, in this case, it's not always the father by any means, but the father is so wounded in this. His capacities as a lover, as a human lover, are so damaged by his childhood experience that he cannot have an affair. That would be too much of an attainment, too much of an achievement. He cannot have an affair. And so this is projected on the most defenseless one in the environment. This is one of the daughters. But it is projected on her. She becomes the archetypal lover and is the source. And often you get these daughters in these situations who are their father's little hetara, his little lover. And, of course, this wounds them for life unless they get outstanding help, which is not very often. But you're absolutely right about that. See, you just look at family systems theory. Just remember, this stuff is all occurring in family system. And all of these archetypal patterns are either accepted and encouraged or repressed and split off within a family system. Each family handles it different. You might even say each culture handles it different. But you think about it particularly in terms of the family system. Ask in your family what they did with the archetypal lover. It's been a European pattern, carried over to some degree, that the archetypal lover is always split off outside the family. The family is the mother and father. And the husband calls the wife mother, and the mother calls the husband daddy, and they have affairs. But that's all an archetypal dance. Now, one of the things we can talk about after our break is the way in which these four things regulate each other, or are supposed to. If there's no lover, the other things go awry. If there's not an adequate, healthy expression of the archetypal lover, there's no eros in these other forms, and that's very dangerous. You get necrophilia then. Okay, let's take about a 10-minute break. About the relationship of these things and when they go awry. Let me just go over that briefly and lift up how I see that reflected. Clearly, in this little story of Camelot, the King Arthur doesn't feel very much like a king. He's not really very much in touch with the archetype. He's very intimidated by the role. And he's constantly looking for everybody else to tell him how to do it. Lancelot is pictured as somebody coming in as all warrior, pure, not a profligate bone in his body, according to his presentation of it. But in them both is this being split off from the lover. When Arthur finally does get into being king, he forgets to mind the lover part of his responsibilities. And that creates a situation in which Lancelot's shadow is given a real encouragement to constellate, come out, says him having doing exactly what he always claimed he would not do, which is to destroy the world, in effect. Now that the absence of the insights of Merlin from both personalities should strike you in the context of our discussion. If Arthur had had enough Merlin, he would have had enough insight into men and women to know that he couldn't get away with neglecting his role as a lover. If Lancelot had had enough Merlin, he would have understood that he wasn't that out of touch with the possibility to be an adulterer. So in that story, you have a very subtle, insightful rehearsal of these dynamics. You just look, get past the sort of trite comedy of it, and look at the archetypal relationships. The king gives a person a sense for realm and power and responsibility, being the orderer. Without the lover present, though, there won't be a capacity to really take delight in the realm. And if you can't take delight in your children or your subjects, so to speak, if you can't see how beautiful they are in and of themselves, then you won't want to build a world for them. You will not want to create a cosmos for them. This is what happens with your shadow king. Your shadow king hasn't got enough love. He doesn't really care that much about the subject. He really cares very little even about himself, but he cares more about himself than he does about anybody else. And so you can see how when that archetypal lover aspect is not present in the king, he will be a shadow king. Look at the Magus. Magus gives you great power of seeing. Look in and you understand and you know. But if that archetypal lover is not constellated in a mature, healthy way, you will be in that thing like you are in the king in the similar thing. You will not truly love those for whom you are trying to create transformation. What does that mean? Well, what it means is you're not really seriously interested in their transformation. What it means is you're interested in their adulation and their money. And the fact of the matter is, if you study a lot of the literature on countertransference and transference, more and more, like I just got this new book on Kohut's legacy, there's this wonderful article in there by this person that's saying a lot of the diagnosis of patients of analysans as really being borderline is because of the lack of the empathic capacities of the therapist. A lot of the tendency to re-diagnose difficult patients, quote, difficult patients, unquote, is really grounded in the lack of empathic. That's what the Coalitions want to say. They don't want to say love. That would embarrass them. They would not be professional. What they're talking about is love. What they're talking about is the capacity for the therapist to love the analysan appropriately. Now, they will never admit to that, but that's what it's talking. If the lover is not constellated in the Magus will be a shadow Magus, because without the Eros, the capacity to appreciate the beauty and the wonder, the miraculousness of this being out here that is not me, without that, there is no reverence. And without reverence, and I don't even mean respect, I mean reverence. Without reverence, there's no healing. There's no healing. Yes.
Defining the borderline personality is like, I had a vague sense of it.
Well, it's hard to define. A lot better people than I am have not done a good job defining it. But what it means is somebody who's been so wounded developmentally that they are enormously unstable. They're not psychotic most of the time, but they are very sensitive to trauma and stress and will go into sort of mini psychoses under trauma or stress. And and usually act out a lot, are very self-destructive in attempts just to stay minimally cohesive. And, most of the people that are substance abusers in a pretty big way are in this category. Most alcoholics are borderlines. But it's just widespread. And they are very close to the archetypal, another way to say it. That is, their ego structures are so fragile that they're sort of like a landing strip for UFOs, It's like they blank, and you up there, and they just, you land. You get a lot of borderlines that are shamans. If you have these self-announced shamans, a lot of them borderlines, but that's when the Magus lands. The Magus land, they're probably a shaman. If the king lands, they think they are, they're going to run for president, like some of these right-wing dudes. I can't think of his name right now. Yeah. Well, LaRouche. If the lover lands, then you've got all this promiscuous acting out, so and so on, so. Well, yeah. I think it'd be more like Lieutenant Calley. That would be more clear. Lieutenant Calley, the My Lai lieutenant. So that when this warrior or when this archetype, that's when you don't have a strong ego, you're just a landing strip for the archetypal. Yes, archetypal possession. And it's much more common than people think about. To understand, you look at most, if you're Jungian and you're not, if you're a classical Jungian and you understand this business, then most of severe psychopathology is clearly possession. And a lot of not very severe psychopathy. But you have to get a sense for the way this would look. Your narcissistic personality disorder is clearly a possession, of the king. A lot of the time, the sociopath is a warrior possession. And you can see that in the way in which the warrior is so constellated in your criminal culture. But anyway, but when that lover is not balanced by the centeredness of the king and by the loyalty of the warrior. If you don't have that loyalty quality that the warrior has, you won't ever be loyal to the transpersonal things, and you'll just go running after the first Aphrodite or the first Eros that comes along. And your responsibilities, without the warrior archetype, your responsibilities, they're just not that important. And without the Magus, all of these things get out of whack. Because you're not aware of what's going on. And this is why, like if you look back, think of David, the king, and Nathan the prophet. You know that story? Well, here's a David who is this. If you don't know about David, first thing you should do, if you haven't read the story, you should get the movie with Richard Gere, of all people, playing David, king. And the casting isn't as bad as you might think, because Gere does a good job of playing this crazy archetypal lover. If you haven't seen him in all these, he plays the crazy archetypal lover in all these. He's the crazy, sort of stoned lover in all these. I'm thinking of that thing where they have Jerry Lee Lewis music playing on anyway, you just look at Richard Gere's movies. It's always this crazy archetypal lover. Well, when they cast him in the role of David, they intuited, I don't think they had thought this through, but they intuited the sense in which David was having a problem with the archetypal lover. David the king, here he is the king, great warrior, fantastic warrior, par excellence, magnificent general, and yet a great lover who loved Saul the king so much he had a chance to kill him and wouldn't. His son, Absalom, tries to overthrow him and to have him killed, but he loves his son Absalom so much he doesn't want the son killed. See? And then he sees Bathsheba, right? The wife of Uriah. And he loves her when he looks down upon her naked body. And truly he does love her. Sees her beauty. And he is overwhelmed with this. He sends Uriah off to the front where he knows he'll be killed. And then, but you see, he's completely unaware of the immorality at this point for what he's done. The biblical tradition presents him as not being in touch with this. Then Nathan the prophet, the Magus, comes in, confronts him. In one of those stories where the Magus doesn't get killed. Very dangerous being a Magus. Because you tell the truth when you're a Magus. The true Magus tells the truth to these others. And it's never good news. That's one thing about the Magus. When your Magus is constellated, it never tells you what you want to hear. It always tells you, oh no, think again. What are you doing? But anyway, so Nathan tells David what he's done. He uses a teaching story. It's like in Zen or somebody that uses a teaching story to get David to indict himself. And then it's presented and the whole thing goes on from there. But it is a magnificent story of a magnificent man. And I always like to say to people, David is as good as we get. This is as good as we get, this image of him. In the biblical story, the humans don't get much better than David. And you look at him, boy, you talk about shadow and warts and misbehaviors. They're clear. But all the Psalms, are allegedly his prayers. And they are good for those that have no objection to them. They're good things to read to help you with your ego self-access because they're real honest. But anyway, you see that in that. You see the tendency to be disordered in one or the other of these. And the task is for them to be mutually regulating. And when any of them are not adequately present, in David's case it is the Magus. He was split off from the insight into what was going on. He was able conveniently not to notice what he was doing and what it really meant. Well, it turns out that he pays very dearly. He marries the woman, but their firstborn dies, and that is presented in the story as his punishment. Like in so many of those things, you wonder who's paying the price here. But
maybe they did foretold.
Yeah. But the point is a teaching story is that when you encounter the Magus and you've been inflated, there will have to be a sacrifice. There will have to be some humiliation. And see, in the initiatory process, we always talk about humiliation always being a part of initiation. Well, humiliation is always a part of individuation. But what is it that's humiliated? Only the grandiosity. It's like if you're not puffed up, it's hard to be knocked down. You don't get deflated unless you are inflated. So anyway, let's open it up now. We've got about a quarter of an hour, and if you have questions to raise, just jump in, go as fast as we can. See the way that they're articulating together.
And what the combination is.
All of them.
Magus, King.
You have to be, because if you had no lover, you would really not have value in yourself. See, it's only when you're possessed by the archetypal lover that you see the value in everyone, and therefore value no one. See, no loyal. But see, I really believe that you can access those archetypal, that you should access those archetypal lover energy, and that we have, feel we have a moral imperative to develop that archetypal lover in us so that we can have that kind of consciousness that you see in the artist. It's not, these people that talk about the arts and the artist as mediating something transformative and essential to the human race. See, this is what they're getting at. The artist is the person who is trying to help people to get past the repression of this lover aspect so that you can see it. William Blake talks about it. Cleansing the perception, the doors of perception. So hopefully you get to where you can love very, very promiscuously without acting out all over them. It's this today. See what I mean? Because you ought to be able, see, in my view, see, here's the thing that I think that it's very important to learn from the gay community. See, I think that one of the things the gay community, both male and female, may be there for the human race, is to help people learn to love same sex in a much more healthy way. Because most of the time, most of us are so damaged in our same-sex relationships that it's very difficult for us really to take delight in someone of our own sex, especially in their physical beauty, their beauty. And one of the things that I think that is being compensated by the gay community in the general culture is the very narrow way in which we allow ourselves to see beauty and celebrate it. See, very few men can look even in the mirror and say, you're beautiful. It's very, very few. And they should be able to read Leaves of Grass. Walt Whitman. You want to know what I'm talking about? Read Walt Whitman. Or any other decent writer. D.H. Warren. We struggle to keep these things in balance in a society. It is. Well, you see, this is what people underestimate. Because staying away from the archetypal makes a lot of sense if you understand the difficulty of what you're talking about. Because the seductive power of these things, it's just like an undertow at the beach. If you've been wiped out lately with an undertow in the surf, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, the guy that you're walking out just a little ways and it picks you up, and yanks your feet off muddy, and just slams you down into the bottom. Pow! That's the way this works. Hence, the importance, and there are Jungians, I won't call any names, but James Hillman are the initials. There are some Jungians that at least sound like they're disparaging ego psychology. And sort of saying it's not important, the ego, really too much stuff said about the ego. Well, the ego is enormously important in terms of developing its capacity to resist the seduction and the possession of these archetypal patterns. You see, these archetypal patterns are real. And they're not, to talk about them as patterns is even misleading. They are entities with their own shape and their own agendas and their own magnetic fields. And when you get into one, then it has its own agenda for you. You really get into the professional workaholic persona. Your ego isn't doing all that. Once you start getting into that workaholic thing, that archetypal warrior is coming out, getting you more committed in every way and wanting more and more and more of you. That's why there's never enough time. That's why the stuff that one takes home in the briefcase gets getting fatter and fatter and fatter. So the important thing is to realize how seductive these things are. They have their agency. They're a source of initiative. And that one has to stand up against that. And standing up against it is not easy. And so it requires discipline. That's the bad news. The development of the ego self-axis requires discipline, because what you want to do is to access that energy, use it as instinctual fuel, but not be had by it. And that is, you're right. You're seeing the problem. It's enormously difficult. And with the fewer containers we've got now, there are fewer and fewer cultural supports to help us keep from, acting it all out.
It's the magus that keeps
the inner. The magus talks to you, So it's always like Merlin or Nathan is saying now, what's up? What are you up to now? Aren't your circuits heating up a little bit now? Don't you really think you need to go to the gym today instead of doing one more project? When was the last time you took her out? Or when was the last time you took the time really to smell of him and let him know it? See, the magus will ask all these questions, provided there's enough lover there for the magus to give it there. Okay. Yeah.
But I get a chance to hear a number of people's story, and one of the things that I hear frequently is, particularly in Valley Bells, is there's been a relationship where it's oftentimes the term was used to soulmates. Hence, I have found soulmate. Sometimes there's relationship where sometimes they don't. And my question has to do with what's going on there, and what's the distinction between loving everybody and having a soulmate or several soulmates? Is there a distinction there? It seems like it's two kinds of loves.
Yeah, well, it's related. Christians have been too quick to divide these things up. That they are related. There are distinctions. The important thing I would say there is the soulmate has got to be a human. And that's where Jungian stuff comes in, talks about this anima projection or animus projection. See, the anima or animus is really archetypal projection. In other words, when you're projecting your anima or your animus onto a lover, that is an archetypal projection that's going to be disappointed. And it is not appropriate for it to be left on that outer person. Because when it is, it will guarantee the destruction of the relationship, or it will guarantee a very, very dependent kind of sort of regressive relatedness. When you're projecting that inner contrasexual archetypal figure on the other, you will be dependent in a destructive way, as long as that is consuming the relationship. That is the archetypal lover projection. Now, if by soulmate they mean a human partner who you take delight in and who you share many things with, and who can play the role, say, for the man, of the hitara, the companion, that woman has a lot of Aphrodite in her, but she is not Aphrodite. It's one thing to be with a partner that has a lot of the archetypal lover mediated through them. It's quite another thing to think they are the archetype. And I think that's the distinction. When I hear soulmate, like I think of one guy, 30 years old, he's had this projection on this woman that he's loved from afar for years. And she is his soulmate. Well, she is his anima. And she's been trying to get him to leave her alone for years. And he can't, because if he did, he would have to deal with how wounded he is in his loves. And he's not prepared to do that. And he is a borderline. So the important thing, is whether, the archetypal lover thing will make it possible for you to experience another person as a partner, a delightful soulmate. But the important thing is how much loader is being jacked up on them. And a lot of time it's Redeemer, Savior, save me. Everybody else has been blah, blah, blah. You're gonna save me. You're not gonna have any flaws. You're going to be able essentially to mirror me in Coet's terms. To mirror me. Well, a lover will mirror you for a little while.
Yeah. Lula Laird said, instead of two lovers looking into each other's eyes, two lovers sitting next to each other looking at the arrow on it, loving, talking, they love the world together.
Yeah. Yeah, that is, it is not just compulsive. But I think I do think that it's not infatuation to be so delighted by somebody that you're in a relationship with, that they just delight you so much that you can hardly stand it. I don't think that's crazy at all. I've known a lot of people like that. And I've known a lot of people for whom, after they get married, there's more delight in each other as the time goes on. It's just that most of our experiences are not like that. But I mean, it doesn't, Robert Johnson confuses people sometimes on this. The way he presents it. Robert Johnson, he said, you can have him edit this stuff out if you want. But a lot of the stuff he says in we, tones down the relationship between lovers to the extent that it's loses a lot of life, in my view. And I don't think that's necessary. I think you can have a lot of energy between lovers and not be a possession. In fact, I think people like Marcuse and Norman Brown and some of these poets understand that. And people shouldn't settle for boredom in a relationship. That's crazy.
In my understanding, Adora was incorrect. I had the sense that he was trying to be safely relating. It's reacting to his over cerebral, over kind of analytical approaches to things and letting these archetypes really live. I mean, he may have got off kind of half-cocked and kind of got off one way a little too far, but
I'm sure he had the best of motivations, but we have to take responsibility for what we say. You know, the fact is, he says a lot of things, in my view, that I would not want any therapist operating on. See, he's a brilliant man. I love reading his stuff. But I'd like to watch him treat a borderline.
at his own work.
See, I don't know. I never had the chance to watch him through a two-way window and see him treat a borderline and see if he's as much of a deconstructionist dealing with a borderline as he is as he talks. Because, frankly, a borderline doesn't need any deconstructionist. They are a deconstructionist. They need a constructionist. And so I don't think it's just matter of emphasis. I think Hillman is really missing a lot of the essentials of Jungian psychology.
Finding the sense he was reacting against his own.
Well, he was director of studies at the Jung Institute in Missouri for a while. I'm sure he's reacting to that. And the literalism. You know, there's a lot of literalism among some Jungians, and that's a problem. But, you know, it's a long way from being a literalistic Jungian to deconstructing the ego and the archetypes till they don't really mean anything. What I'm saying, the archetypal psychology I'm propounding believes both in the reality of the archetypal structures that are deep structures that are in the psyche, that can be seen by anybody that's been trained, and the reality of the ego, without which people are either crazy or in danger of being crazy. And you get, it's one thing, it's, you know, a lot of Freudians, good solid Freudians, need to read Hillman. But I fear for what happens with a lot of people that don't know anything about ego psychology, self-psychology, or object relations theory that read Hillman and then start practicing on people. That's all I got to say.
Yeah. This relates to what we're talking about, the container.
Yeah.
That I don't quite understand that fully. You were saying that something about society doesn't provide.
In the old days, your tribe's values were clear, and you transgressed them to your own risk. They would banish you or kill you if you got too far afield. It wasn't any problem about knowing what the values were. You know, you've heard all this stuff about the crack in the cosmic egg. Well, until modernity, there weren't any cracks in the cosmic egg. People didn't have a crisis of meaning. The only crisis of meaning you had was when your cosmic egg didn't agree with the one that had the political power. Like if you were one of the heretics in the medieval period, you didn't have them. You knew what was right. You had your values clear. They just differed with the Pope, and the Pope had his troops. And but in modernity, things have just, the containers in which that carry the human soul have just been dissolving all over the place. And the best thing to do, if you haven't studied this in history or cultural history, is to read Peter Berger, the great sociologist, and read his book, The Homeless Mind. And it lays this out. But the fact is, religions, for educated people, tend not to hold it anymore. Now, the reason around the world that fundamentalisms are resurgent in every tradition is because of the need for containment. And we should not laugh at people so much about this. They understand something. The Ayatollah, one of the reasons that the Ayatollah is doing what he is doing is not as bad a reason as we might think without thinking about it. He has looked at what is happening to the young people in his culture who have gotten into Western culture, into drugs, sex, and rock and roll in a totally out of control way. And he's decided, hey, this stuff is destructive for my people. And he and the other Shiites, that's what they're about. They are against nihilism and antinomianism. And, you know, if you start looking at what's happening to the young people of this country, you have to ask the question, okay, you don't want the Ayatollah, and you don't want Jerry Falwell, and you don't want blah, 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 blah. Where are the containers to help these young people not destroy themselves before they're 21? Yes. The whole issue is, you see, where are the cultural vessels? Well, I'll tell you some names of some cultural vessels in our society for young people. Madonna. That's a cultural vessel for a lot of young people. You got to be clear about it. Prince is a cultural vessel for a lot of people. Well, that's a magus. Prince is a magus. If you haven't been to any of Prince's movies. He's amazing. Yeah. Somebody else had their hand up. We're out of time. I'll stick around a few minutes and talk with you individually. I've really enjoyed this. You've been great. It's been a pleasure to be with you.